Marcus Vale threw the champagne before anyone could react. The crystal flute left his hand in a slow, arrogant arc, and the entire content splashed across Zara Ellington's chest, soaking through her ivory silk dress in a cold, spreading stain that silenced 200 people in an instant. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Zara stood there, dress ruined, champagne dripping from her collarbone onto the polished deck of the most exclusive private yacht in Hong Kong harbor. And Marcus smiled, that old, practiced smile she once believed meant safety, and said, loud enough for every investor, every celebrity, every powerful person on that deck to hear, you were always nothing without me. Remember who gave you this life. If you believe a woman's silence is weakness, keep watching. Because the silence that followed was not defeat. It was the last moment of calm before everything Marcus Vale had killed apart. If this is your first time on this channel, hit subscribe and turn on notification. Stories like this one do not come twice. Drop your city and country in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me because the man walking through that private corridor behind Marcus is not a guest. He is a reckoning. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier, slipped beneath the door of Zara Ellington's apartment in a cream envelope with no return address and gold embossed, lettering that read, Hanseong Maritime Holdings Annual Stakeholders Gala Vessel, the Cheongwang Hong Kong International Waters. She almost threw it away. She had spent the better part of 2 years trying to disappear from exactly this kind of world, the polished, glass-surfaced world of people who spoke in millions and laughed at the wrong things, and kept secrets the way other people kept furniture. Organized, useful, and never discussed in mixed company. Zara was 32 years old, and she had lived 3 lives inside those years. The girl from Atlanta, who had put herself through business school on scholarships and sheer stubbornness. The wife who had believed for 4 years that a man named Marcus Vale was something solid. And now this, the version of herself she was still assembling, piece by careful piece, in a city she had chosen specifically, because almost no one knew her name there. She had built something real in Hong Kong. A logistics consulting practice, small but respected, with 4 clients who paid on time and actually listened to her recommendations. An apartment in Sai Ying Pun, with a window that looked out over the harbor if you stood at the right angle. A life that was genuinely hers, even if it was quieter than the one she'd left. The invitation sat on her kitchen counter for 3 days before her assistant Tracy called and said, Zara, Hansong Maritime Holdings is on the short list for the Meridian Infrastructure contract. If you show up at that gala, you show up as someone serious. So she went. She wore ivory silk, a dress that cost more than she should have spent, but she'd told herself it was an investment. She'd spent 40 minutes on her makeup, not because she needed the armor, but because she liked the ritual of it. Careful, deliberate choices. Coppery shadow at the outer corners. Dark lip. Earrings that she'd bought herself in Tokyo during a weekend trip she'd taken alone 3 months after the divorce was finalized, as a small, private celebration. She'd arrived at the yacht marina at 7:15. In the evening, the harbor glittering behind her, and handed her invitation to a man in a charcoal suit who didn't smile, but nodded with the kind of professional respect that costs nothing and means everything in rooms like this. The Cheongwang was the kind of vessel that made people stop talking mid-sentence. 3 decks, 60 meters of teak and steel, and engineered silence. The upper deck where the gala was held had been transformed into something between a cocktail party and a private summit, with round tables draped in midnight linen and string lights that didn't flicker, because everything on a yacht like this was controlled and intentional. Zara found her table, ordered a sparkling water, and spent the first 45 minutes doing what she did best, listening. She was good at reading rooms. She had learned it from necessity, not talent, the necessity of being one of the only black women at almost every table she sat at in this industry, of needing to understand exactly where she stood before she decided how to move. She was mid-conversation with a Taiwanese shipping executive named Mr. Chow when she felt the air on the deck shift. Not dramatically, not like something in a film. Just the temperature of the room changed slightly, the way a room changes when someone enters who knows how to make rooms change. She turned her head, and that was when she saw Marcus Vale walking toward her through the crowd. He was wearing a white dinner jacket. He had always known how to wear a suit. She would give him that. He was 41 years old, and he carried himself like someone who had rehearsed every movement in a mirror, chin elevated, shoulders back, the slow, burning smile of a man who believed he was the protagonist of every room he entered. Beside him was a woman Zara didn't recognize. Late 20s, bone-thin, wearing a dress the color of a surgical scar. The woman's hand was looped through Marcus's arm, with the proprietary ease of someone who had been told repeatedly that she was lucky. Zara set her glass down slowly. She had not seen Marcus Vale in 14 months. Not since the morning she had sat across from him in a lawyer's office in Miami and signed the last document that made the 4 worst years of her life officially over. She had not spoken his name since then except to her therapist, in a context that was strictly clinical, and here he was. Her first instinct was a physical one, the tightening across her sternum, the old reflex, her body remembering things her mind had worked hard to process and shelve. Her second instinct was the trained one. Keep her face neutral. Assess the situation. Don't give him anything for free. Marcus spotted her before she could decide whether to move. His smile widened. That was the tell. That widening the way it didn't reach his eyes but spread across his mouth like something practiced in the dark. She had spent 4 years learning the difference between his real expressions and his performed ones, and this was a performance. He was pleased to see her. That was worse than anger. It meant he'd been hoping for this. He crossed the deck toward her with his arm, still linked through the woman's, and he said, voice carrying just enough to turn nearby heads, Zara, I didn't expect you in a room like this. The pause that followed was calibrated to the millimeter. Though I suppose you go wherever the contracts are. It was not an insult on the surface. That was how he'd always done it, the implication buried beneath something that sounded like interest. The commentary wrapped in the appearance of observation. Zara said Marcus. Just his name. Nothing attached. The woman beside him tilted her head and said, oh, so this is the ex-wife. Like Zara was something that had been described to her. Piece of furniture he used to own. Zara looked at her and said evenly, and you are? Marcus answered before the woman could. This is Vanessa. She's in real estate. Very successful. The emphasis was not subtle. You two might have things to talk about. Since you're both in business now. He made business sound like a consolation prize. Like Zara had taken up knitting after the real life ended. She turned back to Mr. Chow and resumed the conversation. She did not slam a door. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned away because the most effective message she could send Marcus Vale was that he did not require a response. He didn't accept it. He circled back 20 minutes later, during the cocktail hour, when the deck was loudest and crowded, and attention was easiest to manufacture. He inserted himself into a cluster of inverts. He was speaking lesson from Singapore and Seoul with 4 men from Singapore who had been listening to her talk about Meridian's supply chain restructuring with genuine interest. Marcus smiled at the group and said, Gentlemen, I see you've found my wife. Then correcting himself with theatrical timing, ex-wife, sorry, force of habit. She was with me for 4 years, so I forget sometimes that she moved on. The pause. Bravely. One of the Singapore investors looked between them, clearly unsure how to respond. Zara said quietly, Gentlemen, excuse me a moment, and stepped away. She walked to the railing at the edge of the deck, looking out at the harbor lights, refracted across the dark water, and she breathed deliberately 4 counts in, 4 counts out the technique her therapist had given her for exactly this kind of ambush, because that's what it was. She recognized it. Marcus had not stumbled into this party accidentally. He had sought her out, or at the very least, seeing her had activated something in him that he'd decided to feed. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of leaving. This was a professional event. She had paid a registration fee. She had clients to speak with, and she was not going to let Marcus Vale chase her off a yacht. She turned back to the party. He was waiting. And this time, he had an audience, several investors, 2 women she didn't recognize, and Vanessa, who had positioned herself where she could watch with the comfortable distance of someone attending a show. Marcus raised his champagne glass in a mock toast and said, loudly, with a grin that told everyone around him to look, to Zara, who walked away from the best thing that ever happened to her. A few people laughed uncertainly. A few looked away. Marcus continued, because silence had always made him expand. She left a man who gave her everything: the apartment, connections, the lifestyle. Walked out the door with her principles and a suitcase. He tilted his head. How's that going for you, sweetheart? The independent life? Zara stood very still. She had learned, through years of navigating rooms where she was underestimated and rooms where she was over-scrutinized and rooms that looked at her, and made quiet decisions about what she must be there. For she had learned that stillness was not passivity. It was precision. It was choosing which battles deserved her energy and which battles she could win simply by refusing to participate. She looked at Marcus steadily and said, with absolute calm, "Losing you was not my tragedy, Marcus. Believing your lies was." The deck went quiet, not the uncertain quiet of before. This was the real kind, the kind that happens when something is said that cannot be argued with, only absorbed. Marcus's smile tightened at the edges. For 1 second, she could see through it the thing underneath, the frustration that she was not crying or flinching or asking him to stop. The old reflex. The one that had taken her 4 years to stop responding to. And then he reached over and took the champagne flute from Vanessa's hand. She didn't know what he was going to do. She should have. She should have read the gesture, the set of his jaw, the way his body squared toward her. But she had told herself the night was almost over. She had told herself he would not escalate in front of this many people. She had made the mistake of believing that public space would protect her. The champagne hit her in a cold, disorienting wave, soaking through the ivory silk, running down her collarbone, pooling at her waist. The crystal flute struck the deck with a sharp sound and didn't break. 200 people went silent. Vanessa laughed, not loudly. Just a short, bright sound that she tried to suppress and couldn't quite. The laugh of a woman who had been waiting for something to tip and was relieved. It had finally tipped in her direction. Marcus looked at Zara with an expression she knew too well: satisfaction, masked as disappointment. He said, "Let me buy you a new one. I can still afford it." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded stack of bills and held them out toward her across the space between them. That's what you always wanted, right? Just the money? Without the man it came from? Zara did not move. She did not take the money. She did not look down at her ruined dress. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that. She thought, "My hands are not shaking." The deck was still silent. Somewhere behind the crowd, one of the yacht's crew members had begun moving quietly toward the scene, uncertain of protocol, uncertain of his role. Zara opened her mouth to respond, not to defend herself, but to say the thing that needed to be said, the thing she had been composing in one form or another for 14 months when she heard the crowd shift. Not a sound, a shift. The way people move when someone enters a room who makes other people move unconsciously, the human herd instinct responding to something it recognizes as significant before the conscious mind has caught up. She turned. He was walking from the direction of the private corridor that led to the upper residence, 6 men in dark suits flanking him in a loose formation that was simultaneously protective and invisible, the kind of security that real power traveled with, the kind that never looked like it was trying. He was Korean, early 40s, with the kind of face that had settled into its own authority over time. Not handsome in the obvious way, something more specific than that. Composed. His dark suit was tailored without being theatrical. His watch was the kind that doesn't advertise its own price. And around his neck, on a black ribbon, hung an access card in black and gold that Zara had never seen before, had never been shown, had no context for. He looked at Marcus for exactly 1 second. Then he looked at Zara, and the look he gave her across the entire width of a stunned, silent deck, with champagne still wet on her dress and 200 people watching, was not rage, not calculation, not the performance of a man preparing to make a point. It was the look of a man who was checking whether the person he loved was hurt. He walked toward her steadily through the parted crowd, and when he reached her, he did not speak to anyone else. He reached up and removed his tailored black coat from his own shoulders, and with the kind of careful, practiced gentleness that has nothing to do with audience and everything to do with habit, he settled it around her. Then he looked down at her and said quietly, in a voice that was not performing for anyone, "Are you all right?" Zara looked at him, at the man she had married 8 months ago in a small civil ceremony with 2 witnesses and no reception. The man who had cooked her dinner on Tuesday nights and argued with her about documentaries and listened to her describe her clients with the kind of specific attention that people usually reserved for things that genuinely mattered to them. The man she had thought she understood. She looked at the 6 security officers positioned at careful intervals across the deck. She looked at the yacht captain, who had appeared from somewhere near the stern, and was standing very still, watching the man in the black coat with the expression of someone who was trying to decide how to position himself in relation to a tectonic event. She looked at the access card around his neck, and she said in a voice only he could hear, "You need to tell me something." He met her eyes. His were calm in the way that deep water is calm, not because nothing is happening, but because everything happening is below the surface. He said very quietly, "Yes, I do." Marcus, who had been watching this entire scene with the confident amusement of a man who assumed the newcomer was about to be humiliated, called across the deck, "Hey, who exactly are you supposed to be?" The man who was Zara's husband turned his head and looked at Marcus Vale for the second time. Marcus held up the folded cash with a short laugh. "She doesn't need a bodyguard. She needs to pick up her money and go home." He glanced at the crowd, checking for smiles, finding a few uncertain ones. "Unless you're here to tell me she's your problem now." The man said nothing. The yacht captain moved then, not quickly, but with the specific deliberateness of someone who has made a decision. He crossed the deck and stopped 2 feet from the man in the black coat and lowered his head in a bow that was not a greeting. It was the bow of someone acknowledging an authority that is not in question. The Singapore investor nearest to Zara said, almost inaudibly, to his colleague, "That access card." His colleague said nothing, but he took a small step backward. Marcus looked at the captain. His smile began to lose its shape. He said, What is this? Who is this man?" The captain straightened. He looked at Marcus with the polite professional expression of a man who was about to deliver information he had not been asked to make comfortable. He said, "Mr. Vale, this is Kong Min Jae, chairman of Hanseong Maritime Holdings." A pause. "This is his yacht." The deck was absolutely silent. Zara stood in the borrowed coat, champagne drying cold against her skin beneath it, and she looked at the man she had married, the man who cooked on Tuesday nights, who had never once raised his voice at her, who had sat with her through 2A.M. anxieties about her business and her past and her uncertain future, and she thought, "I have been sleeping next to a kingdom I didn't know existed." Marcus's hand, still extended with the folded bills, dropped slowly to his side. And in the silence that followed the total, complete, ringing silence of a deck full of powerful people, recalibrating everything they thought they understood, Kong Min Jae turned back to Marcus Vale with the patience of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to make a room afraid. He said, "Money cannot repair humiliation." Marcus said nothing. Min Jae looked at the bills still loosely held in Marcus's hand. "You threw your money at her like it was an apology. Like it was a solution." His voice was level, unhurried. "You built your entire self around what you could buy. And you still don't understand that the one thing you needed, you never purchased." He let the silence sit for a moment. Her respect. Vanessa, who had not moved or spoken since the captain's announcement, took a single, small step away from Marcus's side. It was the smallest physical movement on the deck. Everyone saw it. Marcus looked at her, then back at Min Jae, then at Zara. For the first time since Zara had known him, for the first time in 4 years of marriage and 14 months of silence, and this one devastating evening on a yacht in Hong Kong harbor, Marcus Vale looked like he understood that something had ended that he could not restart. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had built a life on a foundation he never bothered to test, and had just felt it give way beneath his feet. Zara looked at him. She did not feel triumph. She didn't feel relief exactly. She felt something quieter and more complicated than both of those something that sat in her chest like the last note of a song that has finally resolved, after years of holding on to a chord that was never going to land where she needed it to. She pulled the coat closer around her shoulders, and she turned away from Marcus Vale for what she intended to be the last time. Min Jae placed his hand, briefly, at the small of her back, not possessively, not for show, just contact, the kind that says "I'm here" without requiring anything from the other person in return. And somewhere in the crowd, the surveillance cameras that Minjai's security team had already begun reviewing continued recording. Everything Marcus Vale had done to the woman on this deck. Every word, every gesture, every folded bill thrown like an afterthought. All of it on record. The night was not over. Not even close. There were things Marcus had hidden for years, buried beneath the image of a successful man that Zara had once believed was real, and those things were about to surface in a way that Marcus had never anticipated in a room full of people who had the power to make his carefully constructed identity disappear. But that reckoning would come in its own time. For now, Zara Ellington stood on the deck of the most powerful man in the room, wearing his coat, and she was not broken. She had never been broken, though Marcus had tried through 4 years of small erosions and calculated diminishments and the kind of cruelty that works best when it's disguised as concern. She was 32 years old. She had rebuilt herself once already. She knew how it was done. And the man standing quietly at her side, the man with the kingdom she hadn't known about. She did not yet know what to do with what she'd just learned about him. That conversation would happen. It needed to happen. There were questions sitting in her chest that were going to require real answers, not performed ones. But she knew this in the moment Marcus had thrown that champagne. Minjai's first movement had been toward her, not toward Marcus, not toward the crowd, not toward the management of the situation, toward her, to ask if she was hurt. Zara had been in enough rooms with enough men to know that what a person moves toward in a moment of crisis is the truest thing about them. She breathed in the salt air off the harbor and held that knowledge somewhere, steady inside herself, underneath everything else that was still shifting and uncertain and unresolved. And she waited for what came next. The crowd didn't disperse, splitting. That was the thing nobody had anticipated, that 200 people who made their livings reading rooms and managing exits would collectively decide that the most strategic place to be in this particular moment was exactly where they were standing. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Minjai felt it before he processed it consciously, the weight of 200 people holding their breath, the particular pressure of a room that has tipped past the point of social recovery and is now operating on different rules entirely. He had been in rooms like this before, rooms where the air itself changed texture, where the polite scaffolding of a social event collapsed inward, and what remained was something rawer and more honest than anyone had planned for. He didn't like it when Zara was at the center of it. He turned to one of his security officers, a broad-shouldered man named Sio, who had been with him for 11 years and understood the difference between a situation that required intervention and a situation that required patience, and said quietly, "In Korean, clear the immediate area." Politely, Sio moved without responding, because responding was not something Sio did. Within 90 seconds, the cluster investors and curious bystanders nearest to them had been gently redirected a word here, a gesture there, the invisible architecture of crowd management that only works when the people executing it have genuine authority and know how not to advertise it. Marcus Vale had not moved, was still standing in the space he'd occupied. When the captain made the announcement, his white dinner jacket looking less pristine than it had 20 minutes ago, the folded bills still loosely gripped in his right hand. He was the kind of man who needed an audience to know how to behave. And the audience was thinning, and Zara could see the recalibrations happening across his face, their internal calculation of a man who had lost the room and was trying to figure out whether he could win it back. He couldn't. She knew that. She suspected somewhere underneath all his machinery, he knew it too. Vanessa had migrated 3 steps to Marcus's left, which placed her technically beside him, while putting maximum possible distance between them without constituting an actual departure. She was holding her own champagne glass very carefully, like it was the only stable object in her immediate environment. Minjai placed his hand briefly at the base of Zara's spine again, just for a moment, just contact, and then he stepped forward toward Marcus. Not aggressively. That was the thing that made it more unsettling than aggression would have been. He moved the way water moves around an obstacle, without drama, without announcement, with the total confidence of something that has never needed to prove it can move. He stopped 4 feet from Marcus and looked at him with the particular quality of attention that Zara had noticed in him during their first month together, the attention of a man who was not constructing his response while the other person was. still talking, who was genuinely, completely listening, cataloging, measuring. Marcus straightened under that attention, despite himself. Minjai said, "You've been on this vessel for approximately 2 hours." It wasn't a question. Marcus blinked. "So, in 2 hours you approached my wife 3 times. Each approach was designed to humiliate her in front of an audience." Minjai's voice was even, unhurried. "The third approach ended with you throwing alcohol at her in a room full of her professional contacts. It was champagne." The words were out of Marcus's mouth before he could stop them, and even he seemed to recognize how they sounded, because something flickered across his face, not shame exactly, but the awareness that he'd handed something over. Minjai said yes. Just that. Just the single syllable, placed with the precision of something measured. Marcus's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, and the performance came back: the chin elevation, the squared shoulders, the smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked around what remained of the nearby crowd and said, louder than necessary, "Look, I didn't know she was your whatever she is. If I'd known she'd moved up in the world, you would have treated her differently." Minjai said it without inflection. "Yeah." Marcus nodded as if this was a reasonable position. "Because she belongs to someone important now." Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. "Not because she deserved to be treated with respect before that." Minjai looked at him steadily. "Is that what you're saying?" The silence that followed was the kind that has mass. Several people in the dispersing crowd slowed their departure. Mr. Chow, the Taiwanese executive Zara had been speaking with when Marcus first appeared, had not left at all. He was standing near the railing, with his drink untouched, watching with the expression of a man taking careful mental notes. Marcus said, "You're twisting my words. I'm repeating them." Vanessa took another half step to the left. Marcus looked at her, a quick, sharp look, the look of a man checking to confirm that his support structure was still in place, and something shifted in his expression when he saw how far she'd moved. Not enough to fracture him, but a hairline crack. Zara saw it. She was standing 6 feet behind Minjai, still wrapped in his coat, watching the confrontation with the specific attention of a woman who had spent 4 years studying this man's tells and was now watching them surface in a context where he had no control over the room. She had never seen Marcus without control of the room before. It was not satisfying the way she might have predicted. Something more complicated, something that sat in the hollow of her sternum and didn't resolve cleanly into any one emotion. Minjai turned away from Marcus. That was the move Marcus hadn't expected, not dismissal through anger or confrontation, but dismissal through simple disinterest, the way a person turns away from something that has been assessed and found not to require further attention. He walked back to Zara. Marcus said behind him, "I'm not finished." Minjai did not turn around. He reached Zara and said quietly to her, "Come with me. There's somewhere quieter." Zara looked past him at Marcus, who was now standing in the diminished circle of his own situation, the folded money still in his hand, Vanessa a full arm's length away, the captain of the yacht, having positioned himself near the portside steps with the studied neutrality of someone who understood whose vessel he was on. She said to Minjai, equally quietly, "I'm not running from him." "I know." A pause. "I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to walk with me somewhere we can talk." "Talk about what?" He met her eyes. "About everything I should have told you before tonight." It was the first crack in his composure she'd seen since he'd walked through the door of the private corridor. Not fear, not guilt exactly, but the particular vulnerability of a person who has made a deliberate choice and is now accounting for its cost. Zara studied his face for a moment, then she said, "Okay." They walked toward the private staircase together. Marcus called after them, something sharp, something designed to land, but the words dissolved in the harbor air. Before Zara registered what they were, she was already through the door. The private upper residence of the Chongwang was a different world from the event deck below. No string lights, no linen tablecloths, no performance of wealth. Just clean, dark wood and wide windows that looked out over the harbor in every direction, the city light scattering across the water in broken, shifting patterns. The furniture was spare and functional and expensive, in the way that things are expensive when they're chosen for use rather than display. Zara stood in the middle of the room and looked around and thought, He lives like this, and he never mentioned it once. Min-jae poured water from a glass pitcher on the low table near the window and set a glass in front of her without asking. He poured one for himself, and then he sat, not in the most dominant position in the room, not at the head of anything, but in the chair closest to where she was standing, which she recognized as deliberate. She did not sit. Not yet, she said Hansong Maritime Holdings. He said yes. The most feared mafia boss in the Korean underworld. That's what the captain said. He said, that's what some people say. Is it true? He held her gaze in some context. Yes. Zara breathed slowly through her nose. Outside the windows, the harbor glittered and moved. Somewhere below them on the event deck, 200 people were rearranging everything they understood about the evening. She said, when we met, in the coffee shop on Peel Street, you told me you were in shipping logistics. That's accurate. Min-jae, I am in shipping logistics. The smallest pause. I also control what moves through certain networks that don't appear in public filings. Criminal networks. He didn't flinch. Yes. She sat down, not because she'd decided to settle into the conversation, because her legs needed a moment. She put both hands flat on her knees and looked at the floor, and then back up at him. For 8 months. We have been married for 8 months. Yes. And you cooked dinner on Tuesday nights, and you came to my client presentations, and you sat with me when I couldn't sleep, and you never... She stopped. Started again. You never once. No, his voice was quiet. I didn't. Why? He put his water glass down. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and the posture did something to him, removed about 30% of the formidable quality he carried in public spaces, revealed something underneath that was more tired and more honest than the man who had walked across the event sit with 6 security officers at his back. He said, because I wanted you to know me, not this. He gestured, briefly, at the room at the yacht, at everything it represented. Every person in my life came to me knowing, every relationship I've had started with them, knowing exactly who I was and what I controlled. And I never once was sure whether they stayed because they chose to or because walking away from what I am carries consequences. He looked at her directly. You were the first person I'd met in 15 years who didn't know my name before my face. Zara looked at him. I needed to know if that changed anything, he said. For you. The harbor moved outside the windows. Somewhere in the city, a boat horn sounded low and far away, fading fast. Zara said, you lied to me for 8 months to test whether I'd love you. I withheld information for 8 months because I was afraid of what knowing would do to something that was working. Those are the same thing. I know. He said it without deflection, without the armor. I know they are. She stood again. She couldn't stay seated. There was too much moving through her, too much that needed physical space to process. She walked to the window and looked out at the harbor and said, with her back to him, my ex-husband spent 4 years telling me who I was, what I was worth, what I deserved. And one of the things I promised myself when I got out was that I would not be with another person who decided what I needed to know and what I didn't. Silence. I need you to understand what you did, she said. Not defend it. Understand it. Min-jae said, I understand it. She turned around. His face was composed, but the composure was different from downstairs. It was the composure of someone holding something carefully, not the composure of someone who doesn't feel it. I understand that I made a choice that protected what I wanted, and didn't ask whether you deserved to be protected from that choice. He paused. That was wrong. I'm not going to tell you, it wasn't. Zara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, we're not done talking about this. I know, not tonight. Tonight I need a minute to just. She exhaled through her teeth. Sit with what I just found out about my husband on a yacht in Hong Kong harbor, after my ex-husband threw champagne on me in front of 200 people. Something crossed Min-jae's face, the faintest thing. Barely there. It might have been the beginning of something that, in a different context, might have been described as the recognition of the absolute absurdity of the situation. It was gone in an instant, but Zara caught it. She said against her better judgment, don't. He said, I'm not. You almost smiled, I didn't. Min-jae. A pause. The situation has elements that are objectively. Do not. He pressed his lips together. The composure held, but only barely. And Zara, who had not expected this, who had walked into this room with her dress, still damp underneath his borrowed coat, and her chest still tight with the residual shock of the evening, felt something in her own. chest loosen, just fractionally against her will. She sat back down. She said, "Tell me everything." "From the beginning," he told her. Not all of it she understood. Even as he spoke, that there were operational details that lived behind walls. She wasn't going to be invited into tonight, and maybe not for a long time. And she was not naive enough to expect otherwise. But the architecture of it, the organization he'd inherited at 28 from a man who was not his father in any legal sense, but who had taken him from a situation she didn't press him on and shaped him into something that could survive in a world most people never see the edges of. The shipping empire that was real, legitimately, documentably real, worth what the captain had said and probably more. The network that moved alongside it invisible, using the infrastructure of global commerce the way a shadow uses a building. The name Han Seong, the black and gold access card that opened doors in 14 countries. The enemies, and she could hear, in the specific way he did not elaborate, that there were real ones. People who would not hesitate. She listened. She did not interrupt. She was good at listening. When he finished, she said, "Are you safe?" He looked at her like the question surprised him. She said, "I'm asking a direct question. Are you in immediate danger from anyone? Is that danger going to come near our apartment?" He said, "My security infrastructure is..." "That's not what I asked." He stopped. He said, "No, not immediate danger. There are ongoing tensions within certain networks, but nothing that constitutes active threat to my personal security or yours." "Ongoing tensions," she repeated. "Yes. Like what kind?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she felt the first edge of something, not fear, but wariness. The sense of a shape in the dark that she couldn't fully make out. He said, "There are people within my organization who believe I've become too conservative, too focused on the legitimate operations, too willing to step back from certain activities that built the network's place." A pause. Leadership disagreements. They're managed. By whom? By me and by people I trust. Zara said, "How well do you trust them?" He said, "Well enough." And the way he said it, the slight compression around the word enough, the quarter-second pause before it planted something in Zara's mind that she couldn't have articulated yet, but that she registered, filed, and would return to. She said, "I want to meet them," he said, "Zara. Not all of them. The ones who are close to you. The inner circle, or whatever you call it. If I'm your wife, if you want me to be your wife, going forward with actual information, then I need to understand the shape of your life." She held his gaze. "Otherwise, we're back to you deciding what I need to know." He was quiet. "Then some of them are not, the meetings are not. Safe for you, yes. In some context. Then create a context where they are," she said it flatly. Not as a demand. As a statement of requirement, the way she talked to clients about non-negotiable parameters. Min Jae looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, the way people say things they've been thinking, for longer than the conversation. "You are exactly who I thought you were." Zara said, "I don't know whether that's a compliment yet." "It is." She nodded slowly. She was about to respond when the door to the upper residence opened. Seo stepped through. He looked at Min Jae and said in Korean 3 words. Min Jae's posture changed, nothing dramatic. No visible alarm. But Zara had spent 8 months learning the vocabulary of this man's body, and she felt the shift the way you feel a barometric change before the weather arrives. She said, "What did he say?" Min Jae looked at her. He made a decision. She could see him make it in the 2 seconds of silence before he answered. He said, "Marcus Vale is still on the deck. He's been talking to investors. Specifically, he's been suggesting that the documentation around Han Seong's shipping routes has irregularities that certain regulatory bodies might find interesting." Zara went very still. She said, "He's threatening you. He's making noise that could, if it reached certain people, create complications." Min Jae's voice was level. "It may be nothing. Or it may be that Marcus Vale knows more about certain aspects of this organization's operations than I would prefer. How would he know anything about your organization?" "That," Min Jae said, "is the question." Zara stood up. "Then we need to go back down. You don't need to be part of He made it my problem the moment he threw that glass," she said. "And if he has information about you, Min Jae, if someone gave him that information, then you have a problem that isn't Marcus. Marcus is just the surface." She looked at him. "What does your security team know about how he got onto this yacht?" Min-jae looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. He said to Seo, in Korean, "Get Park," and the access log for the last 48 hours. Seo left. Zara set the borrowed coat on the back of the chair. The ivory silk beneath it had dried to a faint stiffness across the front, and she was aware of how it looked disheveled, marked. She straightened her posture anyway, the way she had been straightening her posture in rooms that tried to diminish her for 32 years. She said, "How did Marcus Vale get an invitation to a private Hanseong gala?" Min-jae said, "He was added to the guest list 6 days ago, under a corporate reference from one of our secondary stakeholders." Which stakeholder? Min-jae's jaw tightened fractionally, just enough. An executive named Jung Tae-won, my head of Pacific operations. Zara said, "Is Jung Tae-won one of the people who thinks you've become too conservative?" The silence that followed told her the answer before he spoke it. Min-jae said, "Yes." Something settled into place in Zara's chest, not resolution, not relief, but the particular clarity of a picture coming into focus, edge by edge, from blur to shape. The shape wasn't pretty, but it was real, and real was something she could work with. She said, "Then Marcus didn't find you. He was pointed at you." She looked at Min-jae. "Someone in your organization used my ex-husband as a weapon." Min-jae was still for a moment that was longer than his usual moments. Then he said, quietly, not with anger, but with the controlled, measured quality of something enormous being carefully contained, "That would be a significant miscalculation on their part." Why? He looked at her. "Because they assumed Marcus Vale would be enough of a problem to distract me." A pause. "They didn't account for you," Zara said. "They don't know me." "No." His expression held something she hadn't seen it before, not pride exactly, but something close to it, something more complicated than pride. "They know you as a name in my private file. The wife I acquired quietly, without announcement. The black American consultant who didn't come from the network." He looked at her steadily. "They assumed you were a vulnerability. What are you going to do about Jung Tae-won?" "Tonight, nothing." He said it with the patience of someone who has learned that the first move is rarely the right move. "Tonight, I need to know how deep it goes. Whether Jung acted alone or whether there are others." He looked toward the door Seo had exited through. "And I need to know what Marcus Vale was actually told, and by whom, and what he plans to do with it." He looked back at Zara. "Which means I need to go back to that deck." She said, "Then let's go." He said, "You've had an extremely difficult evening." "I'm fine, Zara." I said, "I'm fine." She met his eyes. "I am not going to sit in a room while you sort out a problem that started with my history. I'm going with you." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." They went back down. The event deck had thinned, but not emptied. 50 people remained the ones who had decided to stay, either because they were invested in the outcome or because leaving felt like making a statement they weren't ready to make. The catering staff had continued circulating with quiet, professional determination because whatever else happened on the Chongwang, the service did not falter. Marcus was exactly where Seo had indicated, standing near the port railing with 3 men Zara didn't recognize, talking with the animated, leaning-in energy of someone selling something. Vanessa was nearby, but not next to him, seated at a table with a fresh drink and the careful stillness of a woman who has decided to watch rather than participate. Min-jae's head of security, a man named Park, who looked like someone had stacked muscle onto muscle and then added a suit, appeared from the stairwell behind them and walked directly to Min-jae. He spoke quietly in Korean, his voice not quite reaching Zara. Min-jae listened without expression. Then he said to Zara, "The guest list revision came from Young Taiwan's administrative account. Logged 41 hours ago. A beat. Marcus Vale's corporate reference is a company called Veradon Capital. Pacific registered, 2 years old. On paper, it's a trade investment firm." Another beat. Off paper, Veradon Capital's primary client roster overlaps substantially with a network we've been monitoring for 8 months. A network that has been making quiet moves to acquire leverage against Hansong. Zara said, "So Marcus isn't just your ex-wife's terrible ex-husband." Min-jae said, "No." She said, "He's connected to the people trying to come after your organization. It appears that way." His voice was measured, but she could hear the thing underneath it now, the thing that had been underneath it since Seo's 3 words upstairs. "The question is whether he knew that when he accepted the invitation, or whether he's simply a useful tool that someone picked up. Zara looked across the deck at Marcus, who was still talking, still selling whatever story he'd constructed for his audience of 3. She said, "He's not smart enough to be the architect of this." Min-jae glanced at her. She said, "I was married to him for 4 years. He's vicious, and he's strategic in a small-scale, interpersonal way. But he doesn't play at this level. Someone recruited him. Someone told him what to say and where to be, and gave him just enough information to be dangerous without being controllable." She paused. She said, "That means whoever is running this used my past against both of us. They brought Marcus here, knowing what he'd do to me. They needed a scene on this deck. Something to destabilize you, something to capture your attention, something to create a situation where your focus was pulled." Min-jae was very still. "While you were managing the scene," Zara said, "what were you not watching?" The silence that followed had a different quality than all the silences before it. It had urgency in it, the shape of something that had been missed, some window that might have been open, some access that might have been taken, while everyone on this deck was looking at a man throwing champagne. Min-jae said, "To Park, quietly and precisely, full sweep, every access point, server room, communication suite, the cargo manifest archive." He looked at Park with the specific quality of a man who does not say things twice. Now, Park moved. Min-jae looked at Zara with an expression that was complex in ways she didn't have vocabulary for, yet respect, and something that was almost alarm. And beneath both of them, particular quality of a person encountering something they hadn't expected in a direction they hadn't anticipated. He said, "I need you to understand something." She said, "Tell me." "If you're right, if this was a coordinated move using Marcus as a distraction, then someone inside my organization planned this with enough sophistication to use your specific history as a mechanism." He let that sit for a moment. "That means someone in my inner circle has been watching you, has been watching us." The harbor was very large and very dark beyond the yacht's lights. Zara said, "Young Taewon." "Possibly," his voice was careful. "Someone working with Young who has access I haven't accounted for." She said, "How many people in your inner circle know about my past?" "About Marcus?" he said after a pause that told her something. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Everyone who had access to my personal security file." "And how many people is that?" he said. 7. She said, "Then you have a problem bigger than Marcus Vale." He looked at her. He said, "We have a problem bigger than Marcus Vale." And across the deck, Marcus finally noticed them standing together. He looked at Zara, not with the aggression of before, but with something different, something she couldn't fully read from this distance, something that looked almost like calculation, like a man who has just been given a signal she couldn't see. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone. He looked at the screen. He typed something. And then he looked back at Min-jae with the smile of a man who has just received confirmation that he is not, in fact, standing alone. The smile was wrong. It was too confident for a man who had just been publicly identified and embarrassed on someone else's yacht. It was the smile of someone who had expected to be outmaneuvered tonight and had been told, just now, that the real game had not yet started. Zara said very quietly, "Min-jae." He said, "I see it." She said, "Whatever they took. While we were upstairs, they already have it." Min-jae's jaw was set hard. He said, "Yes." She said, "So what do we do?" He looked at Marcus across the deck. He looked at the 60 people who remained, watching, with careful peripheral attention. He looked at the harbor beyond the railing, the dark water, the city lights, the endless movement of a world that did not stop its business for anyone's crisis. He said, "We don't run. We don't react. We find out exactly what was taken, and we find out who gave the order to take it." He looked at Zara. "And we make sure that the person who decided to use your past as a weapon understands what they actually invited into this." She said, "And Marcus?" Min-jae said, "Marcus Vale is finished on this deck. He just doesn't know it yet." He started walking toward Marcus. And this time, Zara walked beside him, not behind him. Not under his protection, but level. Her ruined dress and her dried champagne and her spine absolutely straight. Because whoever had built this trap had built it around the assumption that she was a vulnerability. She intended to demonstrate, in very clear terms, that they had made a serious error in their calculations. Marcus saw them coming. He saw them from 30 feet away, and the smile he'd been wearing since he checked his phone shifted, not disappeared, just adjusted, the way a card player adjusts his expression when he realizes the hand is stronger than he thought, but not strong enough to stop playing. He said something brief to the three men he'd been talking to, and they dispersed with the quiet efficiency of people who had been told to disperse, drifting toward the bar, toward the railing, toward other conversations that would give them plausible distance. Zara noticed that. She filed it. The three men were not random investors. Marcus had charmed over canapes. They'd been placed. She could see it now in the two casual angles of their departure, the way none of them looked back. She didn't know their names yet. She would. Min-jae stopped 4 feet from Marcus and said nothing, which was its own kind of pressure, the pressure of a man who could afford to wait, who understood that silence in a confrontation costs the more anxious party more than it costs him. Marcus lasted 11 seconds. He said, "Nice family reunion." He glanced at Zara, then back to Min-jae. "You two have a good chat upstairs?" Min-jae said, "Who sent you the invitation?" The directness of it landed on Marcus's face before his defenses could intercept it, a flicker of something behind the eyes, quick and small, but there, then the recovery, the smile widening back into its practiced shape. "Friend of a friend. You know how these things work. Networking." "The invitation came through Veridon Capital," Min-jae said, "which you've been consulting for since February." Marcus's smile held, but his breathing changed. Zara was close enough to see his chest, and the rhythm shifted. Way breathing shifts when the body registers threat before the conscious mind commits to a response. "I consult for a lot of firms. Veridon Capital is connected to a network that has been acquiring leverage against Hanseong Maritime the past 8 months." Min-jae's voice was the same temperature it had been all evening, controlled, even unhurried, which means either you didn't know that and someone used you, or you knew and you're something more than my wife's difficult ex-husband. Marcus said wife. He let the word sit, turned it over. "That's a big word for a woman you apparently forgot to tell about your whole." He gestured vaguely at the yacht. "The access card." The 6 security officers still positioned at intervals across the deck. "Situation." "Which is it?" Min-jae said. "Used or knowing?" Marcus looked at him for a long moment. The smile was still there, but it had stopped being casual. It had become deliberate, a thing being held in place by effort. He said, "I want a lawyer." "You're not under arrest," Min-jae said. "You're on my yacht, at my event, and I'm asking you a question. Then I don't have to answer it." "No," Min-jae agreed. "You don't." He paused. "But the 3 men you were speaking with are currently being identified by my security team, and the surveillance footage from this deck has already been reviewed, and the access log for every digital system on this vessel has been pulled." He looked at Marcus steadily. "So you can choose not to answer my question. That's your right. But the information will come from somewhere else, and whatever cooperation you might have offered will not be on record." Marcus's jaw worked. He said, "You can't touch me. I'm not touching you. I'm talking to you." Min-jae's voice didn't change. "That's a distinction worth understanding." Vanessa had risen from her table. She drifted, in the careful way she'd been drifting all evening, to a position near the staircase, not gone, but positioned for exit, her wrap pulled around her shoulders, her drink abandoned. Zara tracked her with peripheral attention and made a decision. She said to Min-jae quietly, "A minute." He looked at her. She said, "I know how to talk to him. Give me a minute." Min-jae held her gaze for 2 seconds, the 2 seconds of a man who understood exactly what she was proposing and was calculating the risk of it against the value of it. Then he stepped back. Zara turned to Marcus. She didn't move closer, kept the same distance, the 4 feet Min-jae had established, and she looked at him with the particular quality of attention she reserved for clients, who were lying to her, not accusation, not anger, just the steady, unblinking look of a woman who had been trained in exactly this kind of information extraction by 4 years of being married to a professional deceiver. She said, "Who approached you?" Marcus said, "Zara." Not a threat, not a legal question. "Just me asking you." She kept her voice flat and even. "Someone came to you and offered you something. Access? Money? Information? I don't know. And as part of the arrangement, you ended up on this yacht, on this night, where I was going to be." She paused. "That's not coincidence, Marcus. You're not lucky, and you're not that well connected on your own. Someone set this up. Something moved across Marcus's face, something she hadn't seen in 4 years of marriage, because she had never, in 4 years, spoken to him like she had nothing to lose and nothing to gain, and no fear of what he said next. He was accustomed to her being defensive or wounded or carefully managed. This version of her, this still, direct, unhurried version, she could see it unsettled him at a level below the performance. He said, "You really think I'd tell you that?" "I think," she said, "that whoever used you tonight didn't brief you on what you were walking into. I think you came here believing you had leverage, that you'd make a scene, humiliate me, and that would translate into some kind of advantage for you with Veridon, or whoever is running Veridon." She tilted her head. "But the man you embarrassed on this deck isn't a business competitor. He's someone who can pull on threads you don't even know exist. And if those threads connect back to you," she let that sit, "you're not looking at a bad evening. You're looking at something considerably worse." Marcus said nothing. She said, "I'm not trying to protect you. I want to be very clear about that. Whatever happens to you as a consequence of tonight, I don't have opinions about it." She kept her voice steady and uninflected. "But if you know something about who is running this from the inside, if you know a name, that information is worth something right now that it will not be worth tomorrow." Marcus looked at her. He looked at Min Jae, who was standing 8 feet away with the expression of a man who has put something down temporarily, but has not lost track of where he put it. He looked at the deck, at the remaining guests, at the harbor. He looked back at Zara. He said very quietly, so quietly she had to read the words partly from his lips, "I don't know his real name. I only ever heard him called Director Yoon." Zara kept her face still. She said, "Where?" "The meeting was in Macau, a hotel private dining room. He had 2 people with him. Spoke Korean and English both." A pause. Marcus's voice had changed. The performance was gone. What remained was just a tired man reading from memory. "He told me Hansong's chairman had personal exposure points. That there was a woman he was attached to, and if the right social pressure was applied, the chairman's attention would be on managing damage instead of watching his operational infrastructure. He looked at her. He told me the woman was you." Zara breathed through it. She said, "He told you to come here and humiliate me. He told me to create a scene. He said the chairman would be distracted. He said I'd have 45 minutes minimum before the situation was controlled." He looked away. "He also told me things about you, about the marriage, things he shouldn't have known." She said, "Like what?" Marcus said, "Like the fact that you didn't know who your husband was." The deck was quiet around them. The harbor moved. Somewhere in the city, the ordinary world continued its ordinary business, oblivious. Zara turned and walked back to Min Jae. She said, "Director Yoon, Macau. He knew about me, specifically about the gap in my knowledge about you." She kept her voice low. "That's not something Jung Tae-won would have known from a personnel file. That's intimate operational detail." Min Jae's face did not change expression, but his eyes did. Something moved through them, fast and dark, and she felt the temperature of him change beside her, the way the air changes beside something that has shifted from managed to alert. He said, "Director Yoon." She said, "Do you know that name?" He said after a pause that was 1 second too long, "Yes." She waited. He said, "Come with me." They went back to the private staircase, back up toward the upper residence. But Min Jae turned before they reached it into a corridor she hadn't noticed before, narrower, with a door at the end that required the black and gold card to open. Inside was a room that looked like the operational heart of the vessel screens, communications equipment, 2 men at workstations who straightened immediately when Min Jae entered. Park was already there, standing in front of the largest screen, with an expression that told Zara the information on it was not good. Min Jae looked at the screen. It showed an internal document, Hanseong Maritime Holdings letterhead, dated 14 weeks ago. He stood very still for 6 seconds. Then he said, in Korean, something short and flat that Zara didn't understand the words of, but understood the register of entirely. It was the register of a man absorbing a blow he had not seen coming and refusing to fall. She stepped closer to the screen. The document was a transfer authorization, Pacific operational routes, infrastructure access codes, network distribution maps. The kind of document that, in the wrong hands, could expose the hidden architecture of everything Min-jae had described to her upstairs, not the legitimate shipping empire, the other part, the network that moved alongside it, signed at the bottom with a name she didn't recognize, and countersigned in a second signature block with a name she did. She said, "Who is Lee Hyun-suk?" Min-jae said, "My second in command." His voice was absolutely flat. "He has been with me for 12 years. The room was very quiet. Park said something in Korean. Min-jae responded in 2 words. Park turned back to the screen and began pulling additional documents, dates, transaction logs, access records, a timeline assembling itself in real time across 3 screens. Zara looked at the timeline. She looked at the first date on the access log, the first time Lee Hyun-suk's credentials had been used to access the restricted network files. She calculated backward. She said, 8 months. Min-jae looked at her. She said, "This started 8 months ago." She paused. "When did we get married?" The silence was different from all the silences that had come before it. It had a specific quality, something almost physical, the quality of a floor that has been solid underfoot, revealing itself, in one instant, to have been suspended over nothing the entire time. Min-jae said 8 months and 3 weeks ago. She said, "So the leak started after our marriage became known internally." She looked at him. "Your marriage to me was the trigger. It told someone, Lee, or whoever Lee is working with, that you were changing, stepping back, building a life outside the network." She paused. "And they decided that was the moment to move." Min-jae said, "They've been pulling documents for 8 months, and I didn't see it." It was not self-pity. It was accounting. The specific, painful accounting of a man who had built his entire operational philosophy around seeing things before they arrived, and had missed something growing in his own foundation. Park spoke again. This time, Min-jae translated without being asked, which told her something about the moment that they were past the stage where he made choices about what she needed to know. He said the server room was accessed tonight, during the window, when we were upstairs. 14 files pulled. The access credentials used were mine. Zara said, "Someone has your credentials. Someone with access to the highest level of the organization's security infrastructure." His jaw was set. "Lee Hyun-suk is the only other person who carries master credentials. We built the system that way deliberately to key authorization for the most sensitive material." He looked at the screen. If my credentials were used without me, he either extracted them from the system or he stopped. She said, "Or he's been carrying them for a while, waiting for tonight." Min-jae said, "Yes," she said. "Where is Lee Hyun-suk right now?" Min-jae said, "To Park location." Park worked the keyboard. He looked at the screen. He said something that made Min-jae go very still, in a way that was different from all his previous stillnesses. Zara said, "What?" Min-jae said, "He's on the yacht." She felt it, the full weight of it landing, she said. "He's been here the whole time. He's registered as attending the gala. He has been here since 6:45. Min-jae turned away from the screen. A sound like green wood splitting. The controlled quality he'd maintained all evening was still there, but underneath it she could now see the framework that the control was built on, and the framework was under load in a way it hadn't been before. "He watched Marcus Vale throw champagne on you. He watched me walk across that deck. He was present for every moment of it, and he used the access window it created." Zara said, "He wasn't just watching. He was making sure the scene played out long enough. If the confrontation had ended quickly, if you'd managed Marcus fast, the window would have closed." She looked at him. "He needed it to run long. He needed you to be on that deck for a specific amount of time." Min-jae looked at her, with the expression of a man hearing a shape that he'd felt but not articulated. She said, "He may have even been the one who briefed Vanessa, who kept her laughing, kept the social pressure on, kept the scene alive, so you couldn't shut it down cleanly." Min-jae said quietly, "Find Lee now." This to Park, and the way he said it was different from all his previous instructions, not measured, not patient, but with the particular weight of something that has run out of patience. Park made a call. Zara stood in the center of the communications room and looked at the screens and processed the architecture of what had been built around them tonight. Someone had designed this with meticulous care. They had used her past the specific damage Marcus had done to her as a crowbar. They had timed it around her presence on the yacht. They had positioned Lee Hyun-suk in the room so he could monitor the distraction and execute the extractions simultaneously. It was elegant, in the way that terrible things are sometimes elegant. It was also, she realized, not finished. She said, Minjai, the files that were pulled, what would someone do with them immediately? He looked at her. She said, if the goal was to acquire leverage, they pull the files and then they surface them somewhere that causes maximum damage. Regulatory bodies, media, rival networks. She paused. How long does that take? How long between pulling files off your server and transmitting them to wherever they're going? Minjai looked at Park. Park was already typing. He looked at the screen. He said something in Korean that was 3 syllables, flat and final. Minjai translated. They were transmitted 12 minutes ago. Zara said to where? Unknown. The transmission was routed through 3 proxy servers. It will take time to trace, she said, so they already have what they came for. Minjai said yes, she said. Then Lee Hyun-suk has no reason to stay on this yacht. The realization arrived in the room, the same moment she said it. Minjai turned to Park and said something sharp and urgent. And Park was on the radio before Minjai finished the sentence. And suddenly, the carefully controlled atmosphere of the communications room cracked open into motion. Park on the radio. The 2 men at the workstations pulling camera feeds. Minjai moving to the door. Zara followed. They went down 2 flights, not the main staircase. A service route, narrow and steel-railed, the kind of passage that exists on vessels like this for logistics rather than aesthetics. Minjai moved fast without appearing to hurry, which was something she had noticed about him before, but which took on different meaning now. They came out at the lower deck level, the boarding area, the gangway, the mooring. There were 3 of Minjai's security officers at the gangway. They had not been there when Zara arrived earlier in the evening, which meant they'd been posted in response to Park's radio call. Green wood splitting. They were standing in a configuration that blocked the gangway without appearing to block it, the practiced architecture of professional containment. And standing between them and the gangway, with the expression of a man who had calculated 3 exits and found all 3 closed, was Lee Hyun-suk. He was 50 or so, Korean, with the kind of compact, efficient build that suggested a life of careful physical maintenance. He was wearing a charcoal suit with a pocket square. His face was composed, deeply, impressively composed, but his eyes were doing the rapid calculation of someone who understood exactly what the blocked gangway meant. He saw Minjai. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, it was too controlled for guilt, but something, the particular expression of a person who is prepared for many outcomes and is running through them in real time, looking for the one that still works. Minjai stopped 8 feet from him and looked at him with the expression of a man who has been looking at someone for 12 years and is in the process of understanding that he was looking at someone he did not know. He said, in English, for Zara. She understood Hyun-suk. Lee said Minjai. His English was precise, deliberate. I think you should let me leave. I don't think I should. You won't like where this goes if you don't. Tell me where it goes. Lee looked at him steadily. He said, the files are already delivered. You know that. Pulling me off this gangway doesn't change that. He tilted his head. But what I can tell you about the network that has them now, about what they plan to do with them and when that has value. And that value decreases significantly if you hold me here and trigger a response protocol. Minjai said, response protocol. If I don't check in within a specific window, certain additional materials go out. Automatically. Lee's voice was even. The voice of a man who prepared his exits long before he needed them. Materials I won't specify because I'm sure you're recording this. Zara looked at Minjai's profile, at the particular stillness of it, the way his jaw had set, the way his breathing had gone slow, and deliberate the way it went when he was managing something enormous. She said to Lee, Director Yoon. Lee's eyes moved to her. She said, that's who you've been working with. Lee looked at her with the expression of a man encountering a variable he hadn't fully modeled. He said, Mrs. Kang, the Macau meeting. Young Taiwan opened the access, but you authorized it. You were the one who gave Yoon the operational framework. You were the one who knew about me. She kept her voice even, the same way Minjai kept his voice even. You briefed Marcus Vale, or you arranged for someone to brief him. You knew Min Jae well enough to know that a public scene involving me, specifically not a business threat, not a rival move, but a personal ambush using my past, would be the thing most likely to pull his attention. Lee said nothing. She said you knew that, because you spent 12 years watching what he cared about, what moved him. She paused, and when he married me, you understood that something had changed in him, that he was building an exit strategy from the parts of his life he wanted to leave behind. She looked at Lee with the steady attention she'd been assembling all evening. That scared you. Because if he exits, the network restructures. And in a restructured network, your position isn't guaranteed. Lee said, "You're very perceptive." "I'm a consultant," she said. "It's the job." Min Jae said quietly to Lee, "How long?" Lee looked at him. Min Jae said, "How long were you planning this?" Pause. Then Lee said, "Long enough to be thorough." The words landed on the lower deck like something heavy, set down on hollow ground. 12 years. Zara thought about it, the architecture of 12 years of proximity, 12 years of access, 12 years of being trusted with the deepest operational details of everything Min Jae had built. She thought about the patience required to build a betrayal over that kind of duration, the particular cold discipline of it. She felt something that was not quite sympathy for Min Jae in this moment, but was adjacent to it, the specific kind of recognition you feel when someone has their trust dismantled in front of them, when the thing they were certain of turns out to have been a performance. She knew that feeling. She had spent 4 years inside it. Min Jae said why. It was the question underneath all the other questions. Not tactical, not operational, just the human one, the one that costs the most to ask. Lee said, "Because you were going to dismantle everything we built. The network, the operations, all of it." His voice was still even, still controlled, but something had come into it, something real, something old. 15 years ago, I came to you with nothing. You built something. We built something. And now because you found a woman you want to retire with, you were going to let that go. Give it up. His jaw was tight. You don't get to build an empire and then decide it's inconvenient. Min Jae said nothing. Lee said, "I was protecting what we created." Min Jae said, "You sold it to the people who want to take it from us." Pause that followed was the pause of a man who has prepared his argument and finds it does not hold up under the specific light being applied to it. Lee said, "It's more complicated than you transmitted operational files to a hostile network. You used my wife as a distraction mechanism." Min Jae's voice had not risen. It would not rise. But it had changed in quality. Something had been removed from it. Some last layer of the patience that had held all evening. You used the specific damage her previous marriage did to her as a tool because you knew it would work on me. He paused. "Don't explain it to me as protection." Lee said, "What happens now?" Min Jae said, "That depends on what you decide in the next 30 seconds. He let that sit. Lee stood between the blocked gangway and the space of it, calculating. His composed face was showing the edges of something, now not fear exactly, but the particular strain of a man who has run out of planned moves and is operating in uncharted territory. Zara looked at the pocket square in Lee's jacket. She looked at his hands, both visible, neither moving toward anything. She looked at the careful angle of his posture, the slight forward lean, the weight distribution. She said, "Min Jae." He looked at her, quietly his left jacket pocket. He put something in it when he saw us coming down the stairs. Min Jae looked at Lee. Lee's eyes moved to Zara quickly, involuntarily, which was the confirmation. Min Jae said to his security officers, "Jacket, pocket, carefully." Lee said, "That's my property." One of the officers reached and Lee moved, not violent, not aggressive, a step back, an instinctive withdrawal, the body's automatic response to being restrained. The officer didn't grab him, just applied the particular calm physical presence that says this is not a choice you're being offered, and Lee stopped moving. The officer produced, from Lee's left jacket pocket, a phone. Unlocked. Screen still active. On the screen, a draft message. Unsent. Addressed to a number with no name attached. 5 words in Korean. Park took the phone and read it. He looked at Min Jae and translated, "Initiating backup protocol. Proceed." The lower deck was very quiet. The harbor water moved against the hull of the Changwon with the patient, indifferent rhythm of something that does not care about any of the human business being conducted above it. Min Jae looked at Lee Hun-suk for a long moment, the man who had been his second for 12 years. The man who knew every corridor of what Min Jae had built. He said, "If you'd sent that message, what would have been initiated?" Lee was silent. Yun-suk. Lee said the additional package. Documents, communications, financial records. Enough to bring regulatory attention to Han Seung's legitimate operations as well as the network. He said it without inflection. Enough to dismantle both sides. Zara said, not just enough to gain leverage. Enough to destroy. Lee said, if it came to that. Min Jae said, it came to this. Lee said nothing. Zara looked at Min Jae. She looked at the phone in Park's hand, the unsent message on its screen, the 5 words in Korean that had not been sent yet but existed, that someone on the other end was waiting for. A receiver poised for a transmission that would set something in motion which could not be unset. She said, the backup package. Where is it stored? Lee said, I'm not going to tell you that, she said. If we can't locate and neutralize it, then tonight isn't over. Whatever you have on those servers, whoever has it ready to transmit on your signal, that's a clock running right now. She looked at him. Director Yoon has the operational files. He's already won that. But if the backup package goes out and takes down Han Xiang's legitimate operations, the shipping empire, the real business, the part that pays 5,000 salaries that's not leverage anymore, that's just destruction. For what? Lee looked at her. He looked at her with the expression of a man encountering a line of reasoning he had not expected from the direction it came from. She said, you said you built something. 15 years. You said you were protecting it. She kept her voice even. The backup package destroys it. So what are you actually protecting? The lower deck was silent. Lee looked at Min Jae, then at Zara, then at the phone in Park's hand with the unsent message on the screen. He said, finally, like something being pulled out against resistance, a secondary server, registered to a shell company called Daehan Forwarding, located in a sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just a short, flat sound that came from the upper deck, the specific acoustic signature of a door opening fast against its stop, and then the sound of running footsteps on the external staircase, and then one of Min Jae's security officers coming down the stairs at a speed that communicated everything before he said a word. He spoke to Park. Park looked at Min Jae. Park said in English, Marcus Vale is gone, and Vanessa Cross was seen at the portside railing with a phone. She transmitted something 11 minutes ago. Zara felt it, the full shape of it, assembling itself in the space of 2 seconds, all the pieces that had been lying separately on the surface of the evening, clicking into their actual configuration. Vanessa was not a girlfriend Marcus had for show. Vanessa Cross was the relay point. She had been positioned on this deck from the beginning, not as Marcus's companion, but as Director Yoon's operative. The laughing. The careful drift away from Marcus as the evening progressed. The positioned observation that Zara had read as a woman protecting herself from an embarrassing situation. None of it had been accidental. Vanessa had been the failsafe, the person, watching the clock, monitoring the window, confirming the transmission, and if necessary, sending the signal that Lee Hyun-suk's phone had been meant to send. 11 minutes ago, Zara looked at Min Jae. He was looking at the staircase where the security officer had appeared. His face was the face of a man who has built his life on the ability to see the shape of things before they fully materialize, and who has just understood that tonight, in the specific hours of this specific evening, he had been inside someone else's architecture. His organization was compromised at its second-in-command level. His operational files were already transmitted. The backup package was a locked server somewhere in the city. Marcus Vale, who was not simply a bitter ex-husband, but a recruited operative, was gone into Hong Kong with whatever he'd been given or instructed to take. And Vanessa Cross had confirmed the transmission 11 minutes ago. The clock was running. Lee Hyun-suk said into the silence, "You should have let me leave when I offered." Min Jae looked at him. Something in his expression had changed, not collapsed, not broken, but restructured. The way a building's face changes when the scaffolding that surrounded it during construction is finally removed, revealing the load-bearing thing underneath without any of its temporary supports. He said, "Give Park the location of the server. All of it. The company name, the address, the access protocol." His voice was quiet and absolutely final. "You are going to do that because it is the only thing remaining in this situation that you control." And because what happens to you afterward depends entirely on how complete that information is. Lee looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, in Korean, slowly to Park, the address, the company details, the access information. All of it, given up in the specific, measured tone of a man who has recognized the edge of the situation he is standing on. Park typed as Lee spoke. Min Jae stood with his hands at his sides and his face composed and his breathing controlled. And Zara stood beside him, not behind him, not protected by him, but level with him, and she looked at Lee Yun-sik and felt, in the stripped-down clarity of everything that had been exposed tonight, the specific texture of a situation from which there was no version of going back. Not for Lee, not for Marcus, not for Vanessa, and not, she understood, for herself. Because the woman who had walked onto this yacht at 7:15 in an ivory dress, carrying business cards, and professional ambitions, and the carefully managed aftermath of a difficult marriage, was not the woman standing on this lower deck. That woman had known the shape of her life. This woman was standing inside a different shape entirely, one she had not chosen, but had entered with both eyes open, step by step, decision by decision, through the course of a single evening that had peeled back everything's surface and left only the load-bearing structure underneath. Min Jae looked at her. He said, "We need to move. The server we have may be 90 minutes before the backup protocol auto-initiates." She said, "I'm coming with you." He said, "Zara." She said, "I found the relay point. I read Vanessa before your security did." She met his eyes. "You need me thinking on this." He looked at her for one long second. Then he said, "We leave in 4 minutes." They left the yacht in 4 minutes exactly. Not through the main gangway. Min Jae's security had the boarding area locked, and Lee Hyun-suk in a hold cabin under 2 officers before Zara had finished pulling on the jacket one of Park's men had produced from somewhere without being asked. The jacket was too large across the shoulders and smelled like diesel and formal events, and she didn't care. The champagne, stiffened silk underneath it was no longer the most pressing problem in her immediate environment. They went off the port side, down a service ladder, to a rigid inflatable boat that had been deployed in the 2 minutes since Park made his call, piloted by a man whose name she didn't catch and probably wasn't offered. Min Jae went down the ladder first, and then looked up at her with his hand extended, and she took it, not because she couldn't manage a ladder, but because there was no time to demonstrate that she could, and she understood the difference. The RIB hit 60 kilometers per hour the moment they cleared the Chongwang's hull, cutting across the Black Harbor water toward the city with the aggressive urgency of something that knows it is behind schedule. Zara sat in the bow with her hand on the rubber gunwale and the wind pulling at her hair, and she ran the geometry of the night in her head. Daehan Forwarding, Shell Company, server in the city. 90 minutes before auto-initiation, and that clock had started. She checked her memory, pulled the exact moment Park had spoken 7 minutes ago now. 83 minutes, she said, loud enough to carry over the engine. Vanessa had 11 minutes on us when we found out. She could have gotten to Marcus. Where would he go? Min Jae was on the phone. He held up one finger, wait, and continued speaking in Korean, precise and rapid. She waited. He ended the call and said, "Marcus Vale has a hotel room at the Four Seasons in Central. Checked in this afternoon. Vanessa Cross is registered at the same hotel under her own name, different floor." So they were coordinating from the same building, and nobody flagged it. It wasn't flagged because nobody was looking for the connection. His jaw was tight. Jung Tae-won facilitated the guest list revision. Lee Hyun-suk managed internal security clearances. Between them, they had enough access to keep the operational details compartmentalized. Zara said, "Director Yoon ran this with 2 people inside your organization. Jung opened the door, Lee managed the execution, and Yoon controlled Marcus and Vanessa from outside." She looked at him. "That's a tight cell. 4 people total, minimal exposure." "Yes. Which means Yoon is careful." "Yoon has been careful for a long time," Min Jae said, and something in the way he said it told her there was history there that was not going to be covered in the 8 minutes it took to cross the harbor. She filed it. The RIB reached the cityside pier, and they were off it before the engine fully cut. Moving up the pier steps with Park flanking Min Jae and two additional officers who had materialized from somewhere, she'd stopped trying to track Min Jae's security infrastructure and had started trusting that it was there. Two vehicles were waiting at the pier access road. Black, nothing remarkable, the kind of cars that exist in a city like Hong Kong in large numbers. They got in the first one. Min Jae said to the driver, "Wan Chai, Harbor Road, from the east approach." Then he turned to Zara and said, "The server facility is registered to a logistics company on the 14th floor of an office building. Night access requires a keycard and biometric confirmation. Do we have either?" "We will in 11 minutes." She said, "How?" He looked at her steadily. "You don't need the details of that." She said, "Min Jae, some of the methods, I didn't ask you to explain them. I asked you to tell me what we're walking into, so I'm not standing in a hallway being surprised by something I could have anticipated." She kept her voice flat. "I don't need clean, I need informed." He held her gaze for 2 seconds. "Then, we have a contact in the building's security management. He will have the night access credentials and disable the biometric log for a 12-minute window." A pause. "He costs money, and he will not be reliable again after tonight." "Fine." The server room itself has a manual lock. The code was in the information Lee gave Park. He paused. "The code is correct," she said. "And if it's not, then we adapt." The car moved through the city at the speed of a vehicle that knows which lights are going to stay green and why, threading through Wan Chai with the particular efficiency that comes from having driven these streets in exactly this kind of situation before. Zara watched the city move past the window, the ordinary nighttime business of Hong Kong, restaurants and foot traffic, and the ambient electrical glow of a city that does not sleep and has no opinion about what happens inside its buildings. She said, "What's in the backup package?" "Specifically, communications," Min Jae said. "Internal communications between myself and network associates going back 9 years. Financial routing documentation." And a pause. "Names." She looked at him. "Names of people in legitimate positions, government, finance, international trade, who have had relationships with the network. People who would face significant personal and professional consequences if those names were made public." His voice was even. But she heard the weight under it. Not all of them are innocent people being exposed. Some of them are people who made choices they understood. But some of them are people who were in proximity to something they didn't fully understand and whose lives would be destroyed by association. She said, "People who trusted you." "Yes." The car stopped. They were on a side street off Harbor Road. The office building visible from the corner, a standard commercial tower, 30-plus floors of glass and concrete, with a lobby that was lit but staffed minimally at this hour. The kind of building where the interesting things happen in the floors above the sightline of the street. Park was already on his phone. He spoke briefly and then said to Min Jae, "Yuan is in position. 12-minute window starts in 4 minutes. Min Jae looked at Zara. He said, "You stay with." "No, Zara, you said I was thinking on this." "I'm thinking better inside than outside." She met his eyes. "If there's someone in there, if Yoon moved faster than we estimated, and there's already some at that server, you need someone who can read the room in English without a translation step." He looked at her for 1 second longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "Stay inside my immediate perimeter. If I say move, you move. No argument. I mean it. Min Jae, I was married to Marcus Vale for 4 years. I know how to survive a room that turns dangerous. Can we go?" Something moved across his face, the almost expression she'd caught once before. Gone in an instant. He said, "Let's go." They moved across the street in a group of 5 Min Jae, Zara, Park, and 2 officers whose footsteps were very quiet for men their size. The lobby doors were unlocked. The security desk, staffed by a single man who was looking at his phone, and who continued looking at his phone as they passed, with the studied inattention of someone who has been told what not to see and has accepted payment for that service. Elevator, 14th floor. The ride took 37 seconds and nobody spoke. The doors opened onto a corridor that smelled like recycled air and carpet adhesive, and the specific neutrophil non-smell of commercial office space that exists everywhere on Earth. Half the overhead lights were on the nighttime circuit, dim but functional. Daehan Forwarding occupied the north end of the floor, behind a frosted glass door with the company name in small block letters. that managed to look completely unremarkable, which was entirely the point. Park produced a keycard. The door opened. Inside, a reception area with 2 empty desks. Beyond it, a short corridor with 3 doors. The server room was the last door on the left. Park punched the code into the keypad, the one Lee Hyun-suk had given him, and there was a pause of 2 seconds that was 2 seconds longer than anyone in the corridor wanted to experience, and then the magnetic lock disengaged. The server room was cold, climate-controlled at a temperature that was comfortable for hardware and aggressive for people. 4 racks of equipment, status lights cycling green and amber, a workstation against the far wall, and a man sitting at the workstation. He spun his chair around when the door opened. He was young, mid-20s, Korean, in a dark jacket with a lapel pin Zara didn't recognize. He had a laptop open on the workstation and a secondary device connected to the server rack via cable, and his hands went to the keyboard the moment he saw them. Park moved faster than Zara would have predicted for a man his size across the room in 3 steps, past the server rack, and his hand came down on the young man's wrist before the keyboard command completed. The young man pushed back, managed 1 step out of the chair, and then Park had him against the wall with a practiced economy of someone who has done this specific thing many times and found the shortest path through it. The secondary device was still connected to the rack. Min-jae went to the workstation. He looked at the laptop screen. Zara couldn't see what was on it from her angle, and his face did something. A compression, small and controlled. Then he turned to the young man against the wall and said, in Korean, something brief. The young man said something back. 2 words flat. Park applied pressure. The young man made a sound that was not quite a word. Min-jae said, in English, to Zara, the transmission protocol is active. It's on a 60-minute timer. It was initiated. He checked the screen 22 minutes ago. 38 minutes remaining, she said. Can you stop it from here? If we have the abort code, yes. She looked at the young man against the wall. She said to Park, give me a moment with him. Park looked at Min-jae. Min-jae looked at Zara with an expression that was asking a question without asking it. She held his gaze and gave him nothing back, and after 2 seconds he said, to Park, give her a moment. Park stepped back not far but enough. Zara crossed the room. She stopped 2 feet from the young man, who was breathing hard and had the expression of someone running rapid internal calculations about what the best available option in this situation was. He was scared. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the particular kind of rigid composure that people put on over fear when they can't afford to show it. She said quietly, how old are you? He looked at her. He said nothing. She said, you're 24, 25. You got recruited into this because someone offered you something: money, protection, a position. And now you're in a server room in Wanchai at midnight with people who have significantly more experience in this situation than you do. She kept her voice even, not threatening, just accurate. The decision you made to be in this room is already made. That one's done. But the decision about what you do in the next 2 minutes, that one you still have. He looked at her. His breathing was slowing slightly, which meant he was listening. She said, the abort code. He said, in careful English, if I give it to you, they'll know. They'll know you were here, and the transmission didn't complete. They'll know that regardless. She tilted her head. The question is what your position is when that information reaches them. Whether you're someone who held out and created more damage, or someone who made a judgment call and limited it. She paused. One of those positions has slightly more survivability than the other. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Min-jae, who was standing at the workstation with the particular quality of stillness that communicated enormous patience and its complete limit simultaneously. The young man said, in Korean, a string of characters. Min-jae turned to the keyboard. He typed. The screen changed. He said, that's the code. She said, enter it. He entered it. The status indicator on the workstation shifted from red to amber, then to green. A confirmation dialog appeared. Min-jae clicked through it, and the screen displayed a single line of text that she couldn't read, but that made Park exhale through his with the specific controlled relief of a man who doesn't allow himself to exhale with uncontrolled anything. Min-jae said, transmission aborted. The server room was very quiet. Climate control hummed its constant, indifferent hum. Zara looked at the rack of servers, the backup package. sitting in those drives, neutralized for now, not gone, but not moving. She thought about the names on those drives. The people whose proximity to Minjai's world had put their lives in the path of tonight's wreckage. She thought about the weight of that of being the person whose choices put other people in exposure they didn't consent to. She understood that weight. She'd married Marcus Vale. Minjai disconnected the secondary device from the rack and handed it to Park. He looked at the young man who had slid down the wall slightly and was sitting half on the floor with the expression of someone whose adrenaline has stopped without being replaced by anything comfortable. Minjai said to him, in English, "Your name?" The young man said, "Kim Jae-won." "Who recruited you?" A pause. "A man named Yoon. I only met him once. Everything after that was through a contact." "What contact?" Kim Jae-won said a name in Korean. Minjai looked at Park. Park wrote it. Minjai said, "You're going to go with my associate. You're going to answer every question you're asked, completely and accurately. If you do that, this is the worst night of your life, and not the beginning of a pattern." He paused. "Do you understand what I'm offering?" Kim Jae-won says yes. "Good." One of the officers took Kim Jae-won's arm, not roughly, just with the gentle inevitability of direction, and moved him toward the door. Park followed with the secondary device. And then it was just Minjai and Zara in the cold server room, with the rack lights, cycling green and amber, and the hum of the climate control, and 32 minutes that had just been recovered from a countdown they'd been losing. He leaned against the workstation. Not collapsing, Minjai did not collapse, but the particular weight of the evening settling into his posture. For the first time, the controlled composure showing its cost. She looked at him. He said, "You were right about Vanessa." She said, "I know. We need to find her and Marcus. Whatever they were told to do if the transmission confirmed." "They don't know it didn't confirm," she said. "They'd have gotten a confirmation signal from Kim Jae-won. He was supposed to send that signal when the package went live." She paused. "He didn't send it." Minjai looked at her. She said, "Which means Marcus and Vanessa think they're operating in the aftermath of a successful transmission. They're not in flight mode, they're in execution mode. Whatever the next stage of the plan was, they're moving toward it right now, thinking the backup package is already out." Minjai straightened. He said, "Then they're still in the city." "Yes. And they're accessible." She met his eyes. "Where would Yoon tell them to go after confirmation?" "Not back to the hotel, too obvious. Somewhere they could receive the next set of instructions." Minjai was already on his phone. He spoke briefly. "Then I'm having the hotel monitored. If either of them returns." "They won't return," she said. "If I were running this and my operatives confirmed success, I'd move them immediately. Get them to a staging point before Hansong could identify the breach and close exits." She paused. "But Yoon didn't know we'd identify the breach this fast. He planned around 45 minutes of distraction on the yacht. We were off that yacht in 20. Minjai said, "So we're ahead of his timeline." "Maybe." She said it carefully. "Or he anticipated that too, and this is another layer." He looked at her. She said, "He used me once tonight as a mechanism. He knew my history with Marcus in enough detail to weaponize it, which means he has research on me, which means he knows I'm not—" She found the word, "decorative." Minjai said, "He would have assumed that I managed the operational response and you stay managed." "Right. He doesn't know that you told me. He doesn't know I was in that server room. His model of tonight has you racing around the city managing the fallout while Zara Ellington sits on the yacht being comforted." She kept her voice even. "If he's running additional plays, they're built around that model." Minjai was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What additional plays?" She said, "You. Specifically. If the backup package was meant to detonate your legitimate business, the shipping empire, the public-facing company, then the damage is financial and regulatory. That takes time to materialize. But if Yoon wants faster resolution, he needs you personally compromised." She paused. "Which means he needs to get to you directly. Tonight, while you're still in motion, and your security is managing multiple situations simultaneously." Minjai said, "You think there's a direct play. I think a man who planned this carefully and has been running it for 8 months doesn't leave the endgame to a server transmission." She met his eyes. "He's going to want to be in the room when it ends." 3 seconds of silence. Minjai said to his earpiece, "CO, what's the status on the yacht perimeter?" He listened. His face changed. He said, "When?" listened again. Then get off the vessel. All of them now. He pulled the earpiece out and looked at Zara. She said, "What?" He said, "Someone triggered the Chongwang's fire suppression system in the communications room. All of my security officers were pulled to evacuation protocol. The vessel is being cleared." She understood it immediately, the coldness of it, the precision. "The yacht is being emptied. Your people are off it." "Yes." Lee Hun-suk. He was in the hold cabin with 2 officers. If those officers followed evacuation protocol, she said, "He's not in the hold cabin anymore." Min Jae said nothing, which was confirmation. She said, "This is the direct play. This is what Yoon built the whole night toward. Not the files. Not the backup package. Those were leverage insurance. Fallback. Actual goal was getting access to the Chongwang without your security on it." She looked at him. "What's on that yacht that's worth all of this?" He was quiet for 2 seconds that felt like considerably more. Then he said, "The primary network coordination archive. Physical. Not digital." He said it with the specific flatness of someone delivering information they've been sitting on for a moment. 12 years of handwritten coordination records, source documents, the organizational architecture that has never been digitized because the risk of digital exposure was too high. A pause. "It's in a safe in the primary residence. Biometric lock mine only." She said, "If they have Lee Hun-suk, they have 12 years of working with you. They know your biometrics aren't accessible without you." She looked at him, which means Lee told them the archive exists, and the plan was never to steal it remotely. She said it slowly, letting the shape of it fully assemble as she spoke. "They need to get you onto the yacht voluntarily. Or get someone who can open the safe." Min Jae said, "My biometrics," she said. "Or they find another way to open it." She paused. "Min Jae, who else knows the archive exists?" He said, 4 people. Myself." He stopped. She said, "Who's the 4th?" He said, very quietly, CO. The name landed in the cold server room air and stayed there. CO. The man who had been with Min Jae for 11 years. The man who had cleared the immediate area of the deck when Min Jae asked. The man who was right now on the yacht with the evacuation order and who had just told Min Jae that the fire suppression had been triggered. She said, "Call CO back." He was already dialing. It rang. Rang again. "No answer," she said. "He triggered the suppression system himself. He pulled your security team off the vessel under evacuation protocol because he knew they'd comply. It's a safety order. No one questions it, and now he has the yacht and Lee Hun-suk, and your archive is sitting in a safe in the primary residence that requires you to open it." She looked at him directly. "They need you to come back to the yacht." Min Jae's face was the face of a man who has just counted, silently, and with terrible precision, the number of people he trusted, and found that the count has reduced again. He said, "They'll call." As if in response, his phone rang. Unknown number. He looked at the screen. He looked at Zara. He answered. "Put it on speaker." A voice, Korean, male, older, measured, said, "Mr. Kang, I apologize for the complexity of the evening. I'd like to resolve it simply." A pause. "Come back to the Cheongwang. Come alone, or as close to alone as a man in your position can manage. And we can discuss terms, like people who understand each other." "Min Jae," said Director Yoon. "Yes. You have my second in command, my head of personal security, and you're standing in my home. Your primary residence is in Sayingpun," Yoon said mildly. "This is just a yacht. But yes, I'm standing in a very well-appointed room with a very secure safe. And I'd prefer not to damage the vessel getting into it." Pause that had something in it, not quite amusement, but the adjacent thing, the thing that sits next to amusement in people who operate at a level where almost nothing genuinely surprises them anymore. "Bring your wife." Min Jae went very still. Yoon said, "She's been rather more involved in tonight than my model anticipated. I'd like to meet her." Another pause, and I'd suggest that leaving her outside at this point is the less safe option. People who are adjacent to tonight's events and are not physically with you are somewhat more accessible than people who are. The implication landed without being stated, which was how people like Yoon operated, not threats made explicit, but geometries made visible. Zara said, clearly, toward the phone, "If you're suggesting that being away from him makes me vulnerable, you should know I'm standing in the Daehan forwarding server room and your transmission was aborted 17 minutes ago." Silence on the line. she said. Your backup package is intact and going nowhere. Kim Jae-won is cooperative, and you're on a yacht in Hong Kong harbor in a room you can't open. She kept her voice flat and even. I'm not sure what terms you're offering, but I'd suggest you've lost more ground tonight than your current tone reflects. A longer silence. Then Yoon said, in English, this time smooth, deliberate, the English of someone who has used it in many countries across many years, Mrs. Kang. I underestimated the degree to which your husband shares his operational context with you. That's on me. A pause. But the archive. He still needs to open it. And I have time, and I have his people, and I have a very nice view of the harbor. A pause. So, come to the yacht. Min Jae ended the call. He looked at the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at Zara. She said, we're going. He said, I know. She said, he thinks tonight goes the way he planned. If you walk back onto that yacht and open the safe. Yes. So we don't walk back onto it the way he planned. He looked at her. He said, what are you thinking? She said, the archive. In the safe. Can you destroy it remotely? Is there a failsafe? Min Jae was quiet for 3 seconds. Then there's an internal thermite charge. Single use. Activated by a sequence on my watch. He showed her the watch, the expensive, unremarkable watch she'd seen on his wrist every day for 8 months without fully registering what it was. It destroys the contents of the safe completely. The safe itself survives, but everything inside is gone. She said, so you don't need to open the safe for Yoon. You need to get close enough to the yacht to be within activation range. He said, 50 meters. She said, then we go back to the yacht. We don't give Yoon what he wants. We take away the thing he came for. She met his eyes. And then we walk into that room and we deal with whatever comes next. Min Jae looked at her, the long, specific look of a man who has made calculations and arrived at an answer that is correct and painful simultaneously. He said, if I destroy the archive, 12 years of operational records are gone. The network loses its coordination history. It will take years to rebuild what's lost. I know, she said, and it may not be rebuilt at all. The network may fracture, she said. Is that the worst outcome? He was quiet. She said, you told me upstairs that you were building an exit, that the people inside your organization who opposed you were opposed because you were pulling back from things you wanted to leave behind. She looked at him. If the archive burns, the exit you were building becomes the only available path. He said it was 12 years, I know. The people in that archive, the names, the history. I know, she said again, and she meant it. She could hear the weight of it in her own voice, and she didn't try to remove it, because it was there, and it was real, and she was not going to manage his pain by pretending it away. I know what it costs. He looked at the watch on his wrist for a long moment. Then he said, to Park, who had returned to the doorway, get the vehicles to the pier. We're going back. The ride back across the harbor was 4 minutes and 50 seconds by Zara's count, and she counted because her body needed something to do, while her mind ran through the approach geometry, the timing, the positions of people she didn't know on a vessel she'd only spent a few hours on, in a situation that had no clean solution and at least 3 ways to go wrong before it had 1 way to go right. The harbor was very dark and very large. The Chongwang's lights were visible from 500 meters out, burning steady on the water. Min Jae sat beside her in the bow of the RIB and said nothing, and she didn't try to fill it. Sequences. She was learning the vocabulary of his silences, the different weights they carried, what they meant when they arrived at different moments, in different configurations. This one was the silence of a man approaching a loss he had chosen, which is the heaviest kind, because chosen losses are the ones that can't be reassigned to fate or accident or the decisions of other people. 300 meters, Min Jae looked at his watch. His thumb was on the crown. Zara said, not yet. He looked at her. She said, if we burn it now, we lose the negotiation. We need to be on the vessel. We need to be in the room. Otherwise, Yoon knows immediately that the archive is gone and the situation becomes. She searched for the word, unconstrained. He said, you want to walk into a room with Yoon after the archive is destroyed. I want to walk into a room with Yoon and destroy the archive at the moment that does the most damage to his position. Not before. She looked at him. He came for the archive. If he already knows it's gone when we arrive, we have no leverage in the room. If he doesn't know it's gone yet, if he's still expecting to get what he came for, then we have about 30 seconds of position that we don't have otherwise. Minjai held her gaze. He said 30 seconds is not a lot. She said, it's what we have. He lowered his hand from the crown of the watch. The RIB closed the distance. The Chongwang filled the forward view, the vast, quiet body of it, lights burning, no visible movement on the external decks. The evacuation had emptied the event deck, and the crew had either dispersed or been consolidated somewhere sent inside by CO. They came alongside at the service boarding point, below the port side. No opposition at the hull, which was information, not comfort. Minjai went up first. Park stayed with the RIB on his instruction. Zara heard the brief, tight exchange. Park did not like it. Park's opinion was noted and overridden. She went up after Minjai. The cold metal of the boarding ladder was solid under her hands, and her shoulders ached slightly from the cold and the tension of the last 2 hours, and she noticed that and set it aside. They entered the vessel through the service access, the same narrow steel-railed passage they'd used on the way down. Minjai moved with the controlled velocity of someone who knows a space, every corner and door angle already mapped in his body, no wasted motion. They went up 1 level, 2. The door to the private upper residence corridor was closed. Minjai stopped. He looked at Zara. He said in a voice that was barely air, "Behind me, close." She nodded. He opened the door. The corridor was lit by the low-level night circuit, the same amber-dimmed lights as before. 2 doors on the left, the primary residence at the end. Standing between them and the residence door, with the composed quality of someone who has been waiting without impatience. So, he was wearing his suit, which struck her as wrong, not because it was wrong, but because her mind kept trying to map him onto the version of the person she'd assembled over 2 hours of watching him operate, and the version of the person who was standing between them and the door kept not matching. He had his hands at his sides. No weapon visible. That was also information. Minjai stopped 6 feet from him. He said very quietly, "Seo." "Seo," said Minjai. He said it with the specific weight of a name being said by someone who is standing in the fullest consequence of a decision they made and are not pretending otherwise. Minjai said, "Step aside." Seo said, "I can't do that." "You can. You're choosing not to." Seo said, "He'll burn it." "You know he'll burn it. Everything we built, he'll burn it to the ground. And you'll let him, because his eyes moved to Zara, once brief, because of where you want to go." Minjai said, Seo's jaw worked. He said 11 years. "I know. I was there from the beginning. Before Lee, before any of it. I was there. When you had nothing." His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him. She could see it in the cords of his neck, the set of his hands. "You're going to throw that away." Minjai said, "I'm not throwing it away. I'm deciding what it was for. It was for the organization. It was for survival," Minjai said, and his voice was quiet and completely final. "I survived. And now I'm deciding what comes next. That's not betrayal, that's the point." Zio looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Zara. He said to her direct, the first time he'd spoken directly to her all evening, "You understand what you're asking him to give up?" She said, "Yes." "Do you?" 12 years the organization, the operational history, the network. She met his eyes. "Yes, I understand," Zio said, "and it doesn't give you pause." She said, "A lot of things give me pause. That's not the same as being wrong." Theo looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he stepped aside. Not with comfort, not with resolution. He stepped aside the way a man steps out of the path of something he cannot stop and has chosen not to die for, and the complexity of that was visible on his face in a way she suspected it would remain visible for a long time. Min Jae moved past him without a word, which was its own kind of respect, no performance of magnanimity, no acknowledgement designed to diminish what it had cost Seo to move. The residence door. Min Jae's hand on the handle. He looked at Zara. She said, "On your signal." He opened the door. The primary residence of the Cheongwang was exactly as she'd last seen it spare. Dark wood, harbor-facing windows, the city light scattered across the water beyond. 3 figures inside, Lee Hun-suk, seated near the window, with the particular stillness of a man who has already made his calculations and is waiting for the results. A second man she didn't recognize, standing near the safe that was recessed into the wall behind the desk, young, dark-suited, hands visible, and standing in the center of the room with the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where the wrong movement costs everything. Director Yoon. He was older than she'd imagined from his voice. Late 60s, Korean, with close cropped gray hair and a face that had the kind of settled authority that comes not from performance but from time and from the specific education that only certain kinds of experience can provide. He was wearing a dark coat, and his hands were folded in front of him, and he looked at Min Jae with the expression of a man greeting a colleague after a long and mutually understood disagreement. He said, "You made good time." Min Jae said, "Yoon." Yoon said, "I'd like to discuss terms." Min Jae said, "I know." He looked at the safe. He looked at Lee, who met his eyes briefly, and then looked away. He looked at Yoon. He said, "I want you to know something before we discuss anything." Yoon waited. Min Jae raised his left hand. His thumb settled on the crown of his watch with the quiet, deliberate movement of a man who has already made the decision and is now simply executing it. Yoon said, "Don't." Min Jae said, "It's already done." He pressed the crown. From inside the wall, from inside the sealed and biometric locked and fire-rated safe, there was a sound that was less than she expected, a brief, dense, contained heat sound, not an explosion. Just the specific acoustic signature of something burning very fast in a very small space. The status light on the safe's keypad went from green to red to dark. Yoon stood absolutely still. Lee Hyun-suk made a sound short, involuntary, the sound of a man who has just watched 12 years of leverage turn to ash inside a metal box. Yoon said very quietly, "You burned it." Min Jae said, "Yes." 12 years. Yes. Yoon looked at him with an expression that was not rage. It was something more complex than rage. Something that lived in the territory between respect and fury, and the particular feeling of a man who has played a very long game and arrived at the end game to find that the other player has flipped the board. He said, "You've destroyed your own organization." Min Jae said, "I've destroyed a record of things I'm not going to do anymore." He looked at Yoon steadily. The organization survives or it doesn't. That's a tomorrow problem. Tonight you came for an archive, and the archive is gone. Yoon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "So what are we doing here?" Min Jae said, "You're going to tell me the full scope of what you transmitted to Veridon Capital and who else it's in your network received copies of those operational files." He said it with the patience of someone who is not asking a question. And you're going to do that because the alternative that involves the regulatory and law enforcement contacts that Hansong's legitimate operation has spent 12 years cultivating is considerably less comfortable for you than this conversation. Yoon looked at him. Yoon looked at Zara. He said to her, "You planned this. The server room, you knew about the transmission." She said, "We aborted it." Something moved across his face, not defeat, because men like Yoon did not do defeat in any recognizable form, but the recognition of a changed landscape, the recalibration of someone who has been operating from a model that has been substantially revised by events. He said, "You aborted the backup package." "Yes." "And the primary files, the ones already transmitted," she said, "are a problem for tomorrow." She met his eyes. "Tonight you're going to tell us what we need to know about the scope and the network, and then you're going to make a decision about what comes next. Not a threat of fact. The decision is yours. But you should make it understanding that the woman you sent Marcus Vale to humiliate has been in your operational architecture for the last 3 hours and knows considerably more about your network's exposure than your model accounted for." The harbor moved outside the windows. The city lights scattered and shifted across the dark water. Director Yoon looked at Zara Ellington for a long, measuring moment, and then very slowly he sat down. Yoon sat. It was a small thing, a man lowering himself into a chair, but in the specific context of this room, with the safe's status light dark in the wall and 12 years of operational archive reduced to material that would require a forensic team and considerable optimism to reassemble, it meant something. Men like Yoon did not sit unless they had decided to talk. And they did not decide to talk unless the landscape had shifted sufficiently that talking was the most advantageous available option. Min Jae remained standing. Zara stood beside him, and she could feel the particular quality of his stillness, not the controlled patience of earlier in the evening, but something that had gone past patience into a different territory. The territory of a man who has made an irreversible decision and is now inhabiting its consequences in real time, second by second, without the option of going back to check his work. Lee Hyun-suk had not moved from his chair by the window. He was looking at the dark status light on the safe, with an expression she didn't try to read. Patient Blake neared the splitting, the young man in the darks along the wall, with the instinctive self-reduction of someone who understands they are no longer relevant to whatever is happening between the principals in the room. Yoon said, "What do you want to know?" Min-jae said, "Everything." "That's not a question. It's not meant to be." Yoon looked at him. He looked at the window, at the harbor beyond it, at the scattered city light on the black water. He had the expression of a man doing a very rapid final accounting: what could be given, what could not, what giving it would cost, what not giving it would cost, and whether those costs were still separable. He said the files that were transmitted to Veridon Capital's network. 3 recipients. A man named Cho in Singapore who manages regulatory relationships for the network. A law firm in London that handles document preparation for asset transfers. And a data broker in Zurich whose name I won't give you, because that name is the only thing I'm keeping tonight. Min-jae said that name goes to Park. Tomorrow. Yoon said we can discuss that tomorrow. We're not discussing it. I'm telling you. A pause. Yoon said, the Zurich contact is independent. She doesn't respond to pressure the way. Then I'll find another approach. Min-jae's voice was even. Cho in Singapore. The London firm. I need contact details, and I need to know what instructions accompanied the file transfer. Yoon said the instructions were to hold, not to surface or distribute. Hold, pending further directive from me. Zara said, pending tonight's outcome. Yoon looked at her. Yes, she said, so if tonight had gone the way you planned, if you had the archive, and Min-jae was managing the fallout of the backup package, going public, you would have used the transmitted files as leverage. Not exposure, leverage. Leverage toward a negotiated restructuring, Yoon said. Not destruction. I want to be clear about that. Min-jae said, you want to be clear that you spent 8 months dismantling my organization's security from the inside with the intent of negotiating a restructuring. Yoon was quiet. Min-jae said Yoon-suk, Jung Tae-won, Seo. He said each name with the flat, specific weight of something being cataloged. 3 people I trusted at the level most people never achieve with anyone. You recruited all 3, Yoon said too. Seo came to me. The room was very quiet. Min-jae said Seo came to you. 8 months ago. Shortly after your marriage became known internally. Yoon said it without ornamentation. He was concerned about the direction of the organization. About what a withdrawal would mean for the people whose livelihoods and safety depend on the network's continued operation. A pause. He's not wrong about those concerns, Min-jae. I want you to understand that. Whatever you think of tonight's methods, the underlying concern is real. You have several hundred people whose operational security depends on structures you're planning to dismantle. Min-jae said, I know that. And that's my problem to solve. Not yours, not Seo's, not Lee's. He looked at Yoon directly. Deciding that you needed to force my hand because you didn't trust my judgment is not protection. Control. I've spent 15 years building something that operates because people within it trust each other's judgment. You've spent 8 months teaching me that I was wrong to extend that trust. Yoon said, you were trying to preserve your position within an organization that you could see was going to change in ways that reduced your relevance. Zara said it quietly, without heat. She felt Min-jae's slight movement beside her. Not disagreement, just the adjustment of someone who hadn't expected the sentence to come from that direction. Kept her voice even. That's not a criticism. It's an accurate description. A sound like green network restructuring you were afraid of would have changed what Hanseong looked like from the outside, and what it looked like from the inside would have changed what Director Yoon's role in it was worth. She paused. You built a preservation play, and you dressed it as concern for the organization. Yoon looked at her for a long moment. He said, You're not wrong. She said, I know. He said, with something that was not quite bitterness, but was in that neighborhood. He told me you were a logistics consultant. She said, I am. That's a significant understatement. She said, I read organizations. It's the same skill set. Yoon was quiet. Then he said to Min-jae, what happens now? Min-jae said, now you tell me how to reach Cho in Singapore and the London firm tonight. before their business hours, make the files more mobile than they currently are. You provide that contact information completely and accurately. He paused. And then you and I are going to have a longer conversation about the scope of your network's interest in Han Seong and how we arrive at a position where that interest is formally and finally concluded. A longer conversation, Yoon said. Where not tonight. Tonight I want you off my vessel and out of my immediate environment. The longer conversation happens in a context I control, with legal counsel present on both sides. Min-jae looked at him. You wanted a negotiated restructuring. You went about getting it in a way that has cost both of us considerably more than a direct conversation would have. But a direct conversation is still available. If you want it, Yoon said, and the people I recruited. Lee and Young face organizational consequences that are mine to determine. CO Min-jae paused, and the pause held something she couldn't name. CO is a separate consideration. Yoon said, and me, tonight you leave. What comes after tonight depends on how complete the information you give me in the next 20 minutes turns out to be. He met Yoon's eyes. I don't make promises I don't keep. That's most I can offer you. Yoon considered this. He had the expression of a man who has reached the end of a very long calculation and found that the sum is smaller than he'd planned for but larger than zero, and is deciding whether that is acceptable. He said, all right, the next 20 minutes were not dramatic. They were the opposite of dramatic. They were the careful, specific, detailed work of transferring information in a room where the temperature had changed and everyone present understood the new configuration. Yoon gave Min-jae the Singapore contact, the London firm's managing partner, and a direct line that bypassed the public switchboard. He gave the transmission codes that had accompanied the file transfer codes that Min-jae explained briefly to Zara would allow Han Seong's technical team to identify exactly which files had been sent and whether any copies had been made beyond the 3 recipients. He did not give the Zurich name. Min-jae did not push it tonight. That, too, was information the decision to leave one card on the table, to give Yoon one remaining piece of leverage that was small enough to be manageable and large enough to give him a reason to keep the lines of communication open. She recognized the calculation, and she recognized that it was correct, even if it was uncomfortable. When it was done, Yoon stood. He buttoned his coat. He looked around the room at Lee by the window, at the young man still against the wall, at the dark status light on the safe, at the harbor beyond the glass. He said to Min-jae, for what it's worth, I did not know what Marcus Vale would do tonight. I knew he was volatile, and I knew his history with your wife. I expected a confrontation. He paused. I did not direct him to throw the champagne. Min-jae said nothing. Yoon said, I'm saying it because it's true, not because I expect it to change anything. Min-jae said, it doesn't. Yoon nodded once. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning, she was right, by the way, about the preservation play. He said it to the door, not to the room. I've been doing this for 30 years. It's difficult to separate what you built from what you are. I lost track of which one I was protecting. He paused. That's not an excuse. It's a confession. He left. The door closed. The room was quiet for a moment that was longer than a moment. Lee Hyun-sik stood up from his chair by the window. He was steady on his feet. His face was composed in the way that faces are composed when they are very tired. And composure is the only remaining available option. He said to Min-jae, I could tell you I'm sorry. Min-jae said, don't. I'm not going to. Lee said it without defiance. I made a decision. I believed it was right. I still believe the concern was right, even if the method, he stopped. The method went further than I intended it to go. Using my wife as a distraction mechanism, Min-jae said. His voice was quiet and completely without inflection, which was worse than anger. Lee said, yes. You knew what Marcus Vale had done to her. It was in the file. You read the file. Yes. And you used it. Lee said, I used everything available. He said it with the exhausted honesty of a man who has run out of alternative framings. That's what I am. That's what you made me, Min-jae. 12 years of being the person who uses everything available. He looked at him directly. You can't build the thing you built and then be surprised by what the building produced. The silence that followed was the kind that has too much in it to resolve quickly, too much history, too much truth that sits in uncomfortable proximity to other truth, Too many years of a particular kind of work that leaves marks on people, whether they chose the marks or not. Minjai said, "You'll go with Park tonight, and what follows that process takes as long as it takes." Lee said, "I know." He walked to the door. He stopped briefly and looked at Zara. He said, "He chose well." He said it without warmth and without bitterness, just as an assessment, the way a person who spent their life evaluating assets makes assessments. "For whatever it's worth," she said. She said, "Not much tonight." He nodded once. He left. The young man against the wall followed quietly, without being told, which suggested a reasonable degree of situational reading ability that might, Zara thought distantly, serve him better than whoever had recruited him into this. And then the room was just the two of them, and the harbor, and the dark status light on the wall. Minjae sat down. Not in the chair Yoon had occupied, in the chair closest to the window. The same one he'd sat in hours earlier when he'd told her everything. The chair he'd chosen, because it was close to where she was standing, rather than the most commanding position in the room. He sat, and he put his elbows on his knees and he looked at the floor. She sat across from him. She didn't say anything. She gave it the time it needed, which was some minutes, the harbor moving outside the windows with its patient indifference. Then he said, "Seo." She said, "I know." 11 years, his voice was not broken. Minjai's voice did not break. It was not built that way, but it had something in it that was the structural equivalent of what breaking sounds like in other people. He was 19 when I found him. He had nothing and no one, and I built him. Taught him everything. He was quiet, and he looked at what I was building with you and decided it was a threat worth acting on. She said, "He wasn't wrong that it was a change." No, he was wrong about what the change meant. She kept her voice even, not gentle exactly, but careful. He saw you pulling back, and he interpreted it as abandonment. Of him, of everyone he'd built his safety around. She paused. People who have nothing else tend to hold very tightly to the thing they have. He'd been holding on to you for 11 years. Minjai looked up. He said, "That's almost a defense of him." "It's not a defense. It's an explanation. They're different." She met his eyes. Understanding why someone did something isn't the same as saying it was acceptable. I understand exactly why Marcus Vale spent 4 years systematically diminishing me. Understanding it doesn't make me sorry it's over. He was quiet. "Then what do I do with Seo?" She said, "What do you want to do?" He stopped. Started again. He stepped aside. In the corridor. He could have not done that. Yes. That cost him something. Yes. "Does that count for anything?" She said, "That's your call to make. Not mine." She held his gaze. "I'll tell you what I see, which is a man who spent 11 years making you his entire world, and then panicked when that world started changing. That's human, and it's also not something you can fix or manage or absorb. You can decide what consequences follow. You can't decide what it means about him, because it means several things simultaneously, and not all of them are simple." Minjai said, "He told Yoon about you. Specifically about you, about the fact that you didn't know who I was. That was the detail that made the whole plan viable." She said, "I know." "That's I know," she said again. "I'm not pretending it isn't." He looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded she had seen from him all evening, not the controlled composure of the deck, not the deliberate honesty of the upper residence, but something underneath both of those, something that had been there all night and was only now surfacing because everything else had been stripped away. And this was what remained. He said, "I'm sorry," she said. "For what specifically?" "There's a list tonight. For not telling you. For building a situation where the gap in your knowledge became a weapon that someone could use against you." He held her gaze. "You were right, earlier. What I did withholding the information to test whether you'd love me without, it was a choice that protected what I wanted, and didn't ask whether you deserved to be protected from that choice." He paused. "I've been thinking about what you said in the server room, about your ex-husband, about the promise you made yourself." She waited. He said, "I made you the same kind of promise he made you. Not the same shape, not the same damage, but the same fundamental architecture. I decided what you needed to know. I decided that my reasons were sufficient. I put my judgment over your right to the information." He said it with the specific, careful honesty of someone who has had several hours to sit with something and has chosen not to soften it. "That's not a different category of thing, just because my intentions were different." She looked at him. She said, "You're right," he said. "Yes," she said, "and it's not the same." He looked at her. she said. Marcus withheld things to control me, to manage what I knew so that I stayed in a position where I needed him. He did it with knowledge and intent and consistency across 4 years. She paused. You withheld something because you were afraid. That's a smaller and more human failure, and it has a different name. She looked at him steadily. That doesn't make it nothing. It's still something we need to talk about. And we're going to talk about it properly, not on a yacht at 2 in the morning after someone tried to burn your organization down. She paused. But it's not the same thing. And I'm not going to let you make it the same thing because you're sitting in the aftermath of the worst night you've had in years, and your instinct is to take responsibility for everything in the room. Minjai said, Zara, you burned the archive, she said. That was yours to do, and you did it, and it cost you something I don't have adequate language for. Don't also burn the context of what happened tonight by flattening it into something simpler than it is. Quiet for a long time. The harbor moved. The city light shifted slightly as clouds passed across the distant sky. He said, what do we do now? She said, tonight? Nothing. Tonight is over. She looked at the dark status light on the safe. Tomorrow you call Cho in Singapore before his business day starts. You call the London firm. Your technical team traces the transmission codes and establishes what mobility those files have and what it takes to limit it. She paused. Your legal team starts work on the formal process of restructuring Hanxiang's operational structure. You deal with Young Taewon and Lee and whatever process is appropriate for them. She paused again. And you figure out what you're going to do about CO. He said in us, she said in us. Also tomorrow. He said, I want there to be an us. She said, I know. He said, that's not an answer. She said, I know that too. She met his eyes. I walked into this evening as your wife, who didn't know your name, carried fear in 14 countries. I walked through it as someone who aborted a backup package in a server room in Wan Chai and read a man who spent 30 years running criminal networks well enough to get him to sit down. She paused. I don't know yet what I walked out of it as. I need a night to figure that out. She looked at him steadily. But I'm sitting here talking to you instead of finding a different way off this yacht. You can work with that for tonight. Something in his face settled. Not resolution was not on offer tonight, and they both understood that. But the particular quality of tension that comes from not knowing whether someone is still in the room with you, that eased. He said, all right, she said, call Park. Get this vessel secured and get everyone who needs to be somewhere else off of it. She stood up. And then I need something to eat, because I have been running on adrenaline and a glass of sparkling water for 6 hours, and I am not equipped to have the deeper conversation on an empty stomach. He looked at her. He said, it's 2:30 in the morning. She said, this is Hong Kong. There is food. He looked at her for another moment. And then he did the thing she'd almost seen twice and never quite caught fully. He let it happen. Sips, the expression that existed underneath all the composure and the authority and the history of a man who had spent 15 years being the person that other people were afraid of. It was brief. It was the specific thing that is neither a smile nor its approach, but is the acknowledgement that in a different world, in a moment with less wreckage in it, a smile would be the right response to this person. That she was someone who produced that response in him even at 2:30 in the morning on the worst night he could remember. And that this fact was, in the landscape of everything else, something. He picked up his phone and called Park. She walked to the window and looked out at the harbor, at the water that had been moving all evening with the same patient indifference and was still moving now, unchanged by everything that had happened on the surface of the vessel floating in it. The city glittered. The sky above the eastern shore was beginning, very faintly, to think about the possibility of dawn, not there yet, not even close, but the absolute that 2 hours ago had taken on the faintest quality of something less total. She thought about Marcus. He was out there in the city somewhere in a hotel room, or in a car, or already at an airport, which was probably the most likely option. He'd come here as Yoon's instrument, and he'd done the work he'd been pointed at, and when the scene on the deck resolved in a way he hadn't anticipated, he'd moved to the next stage of his instructions. She didn't know what those instructions had been. She wasn't sure it mattered. Marcus Vale had spent 4 years making her smaller. He had spent this evening believing he was using her as a mechanism in someone else's plan, which was, she supposed, a lateral movement from his previous position rather than an upgrade. He had thrown champagne on her in front of 200 people and walked away, thinking the evening had gone his way, and at some point at the airport, or in a hotel room in a different city, or maybe not until considerably later, he was going to understand the full shape of what had actually happened tonight. She didn't feel triumph about it. She'd thought she might when she imagined this kind of moment in the abstract, in therapy sessions and late nights and the long, slow work of rebuilding a sense of herself that didn't have Marcus Vale's fingerprints all over it. She'd imagined that watching him fall would feel like something clean and conclusive. It didn't. It felt like the end of something that had already been over for a long time, finally going through the formal administrative process of concluding. Necessary and real, and not without meaning, and not remotely satisfying in the way she'd once thought it might be. She was alive. Her dress was ruined. Her husband had just burned 12 years of organized crime history in a wall safe to keep it out of a man's hands, and somewhere in the next few days, she was going to have a very long conversation about the architecture of a marriage that had been built gaps she hadn't known existed, and none of it was simple or clean or the kind of story that ends tidily. She thought, going to be all right. Not tonight. Not tomorrow, probably. But in the durable, load-bearing sense of the phrase and the sense of continuing, of being intact where it counted, of having walked through something and come out the other side, still recognizably herself. Yes. Park arrived with 2 additional officers and a brief operational summary for Min Jae that involved several phone calls and a vehicle and what sounded like a logistics problem involving Lee Hyun-sik and a location she didn't catch. Min Jae listened and gave instructions, and the room became briefly organized around task rather than aftermath. Zara stayed at the window. After Park left, Min Jae came and stood beside her. Not close enough to require any response from her, just present the way he'd been present all evening, with the specific quality of someone who understood the difference between taking up space and occupying it. They stood there for a few minutes, looking at the harbor. She said, "Who was Yoon before tonight, before the network?" He said, "He was my predecessor's financial architect. He built the funding structures that made the organization finding viable when it was still in forms." A pause. "He's been in this world for longer than I've been alive. He knows things about how power moves through certain networks that aren't written down anywhere." He paused. "He's not a good person. But good is not the only interesting thing a person can be. He told the truth tonight. About the Zurich name being the one thing he kept." She paused. "And about Seo coming to him." Min Jae said yes. "You believe him?" "Yes." She said, "That means Seo made the first move. Whatever Yoon built from there, Seo opened the door." "Yes. And you still don't know what to do about him." Min Jae said. "He stepped aside in the corridor." "I know. If he hadn't, we would have been delayed. Enough to make a difference." She said, "Maybe that's the answer then. Not resolution. Not forgiveness or its absence. Just he opened a door to something that could have destroyed you. And then when the moment came, he moved out of its path. That's a complicated person who made a serious error and then, at the last possible moment, made a different choice." She paused. "You can hold both of those things without resolving them into something simpler." Min Jae was quiet. She said, "The people in the archive. The names. The ones who were in proximity to the network without full understanding of it." She looked at him. "The archive is gone. What protects them now?" He said. "The transmitted files that went to Cho in London, those don't contain the name list. That was only in the physical archive." He paused. "The files that were transmitted contain operational routing and financial documentation. Damaging to Hansong, but not personally exposing to the individuals." He paused. "That was, I think, intentional. Yoon wanted leverage over the organization, not over the individuals," she said. "He's more careful than Marcus." "Yes, and more dangerous. In different directions." She turned from the window and looked at him. She said, "You're going to be all right." He looked at her. She said, "The organization, I don't know. That's a longer question. But you, individually, you know what you're doing. You know what you want, and you're willing to pay the price for it." She held his gaze. "That's rarer than it sounds," he said. "What I want," she said, "is what you told me upstairs, before any of the rest of tonight happened. You want out of the parts of this life that can't exist alongside the life you were trying to build." She paused. The archive burning makes that more complicated logistically and less complicated in every other sense, he said. And if rebuilding means going back to things I wanted to leave behind, she said, then you decide what's worth what. That's the only available option. There's no version of this where the decision makes itself. She looked at him steadily. But you've been making hard decisions in difficult rooms for 15 years. I don't think this is the one that breaks you, he said. You sound certain. She said, I'm a consultant. Projecting confidence in uncertain situations is also the job. This time she saw it fully, brief and real, and not performed for anyone, the expression that existed in the space between who he was in public and who he was in the specific privacy of her. He let it happen, and she let herself see it, and neither of them made anything more of it than it was. She said, food. He said yes. They left the primary residence together. The corridor was empty. Co's ghost in the space where Co had stood, the slight rearrangement of the air that significant moments leave in enclosed spaces. She walked past it without stopping. They went down through the vessel, past the communications room with its screens still displaying the evening's digital architecture, past the event deck, which had been cleared, and returned to something approaching its default configuration. The string lights still burning above empty tables, and the harbor still visible and dark beyond the railings. She paused at the railing. The deck was empty. The catering staff had gone. The guests had gone. The particular social structure that had filled this space 4 hours ago. The investors and executives, and the carefully maintained hierarchies of a world where who you were adjacent to determined what you were worth, all of it dispersed into the city, carrying the evening's events in various states of processing. She looked at the place where Marcus had thrown the champagne. There was nothing visible. Nothing visible now. The deck had been cleaned. The crystal flute, presumably swept up by someone who did not get paid enough to have opinions about what had necessitated its presence on the floor. Spot looked exactly like the rest of the deck. She was not surprised that it looked exactly like the rest of the deck. Evidence of damage rarely persists on surfaces. It persists in people. Min-jae came to stand beside her at the railing. She said, when we get to shore, I want to go home. He said, all right, she said. Our home, the apartment. He said, yes. She said, and tomorrow we start the conversation we need to have. She looked at him. All of it. The marriage and the organization, and what the next version of this looks like, and what I need from you, and what you need from me to make any of this work. She paused. Not tonight. Tonight I need to sit in a room I know and eat something and sleep. But tomorrow. He said tomorrow. She said, and Min-jae. She turned to face him directly. The next time there is something in your life that affects something operational, something personal, something that touch on who you are and what you tell me. Not because I can always help, not because I'll always understand, but because I am not a person who lives well on partial information about my own circumstances. He said, I know that now. She said, you knew it before tonight. You chose otherwise. He said, yes. She said, so I need to know that you understand the difference between knowing it and choosing it. He looked at her, and the look was not the managed look of a man calculating his response. It was the direct look of a person who has been asked a precise question and is giving it a precise answer. He said, I understand the difference. She held his gaze for a moment, checking the quality of it, the way she checked the quality of things, not with distrust but with attention, the specific attention of a woman who had learned the hard way that what people say in difficult moments is not always what they carry forward from those moments. What she found in his look was not certainty. Certainty was not on offer tonight, and she wouldn't have trusted it if it was. What she found was something more durable than certainty, the specific quality of a person who has paid enough for a mistake to genuinely understand what it cost and to carry that understanding forward, rather than simply resolving to do better. She had been looking for that quality for 32 years in a succession of rooms and relationships, and carefully managed revelations, and she had learned to recognize its absence much more reliably than its presence. But she recognized this. She said, okay. She turned from the railing and walked toward the gangway. He walked beside her. The gangway connected the Cheongwang to the pier with the solid, unremarkable engineering of a thing built to serve a simple purpose, to let people move from one place to another across a small span of dark water. She walked across it without looking down at the harbor below. without looking back at the vessel behind her. At the end of the gangway was the pier, and at the end of the pier was the city. And in the city at 2:45 in the morning there was, as she had correctly assessed, food a place 3 blocks from the harbor, with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights, and a woman behind the counter who didn't ask questions and produced, in 8 minutes, 2 bowls of congee with ginger and century egg and pork. That was the single most satisfying things Zara had eaten in longer than she could account for. Minjai ate without speaking, which she had learned meant he was thinking about several things simultaneously, and had decided that the thinking required space rather than expression. She ate and let him have the space. Outside the restaurant window, Hong Kong moved in its nighttime configuration taxis, a few pedestrians, a delivery vehicle, the ordinary ambient activity of a city that had its own enormous concerns and was utterly indifferent to what had happened on a yacht in its harbor over the last several hours. The world did not reorganize itself around the events that felt, to the people inside them, like the center of everything. Continued. It was one of the things she both relied on and found occasionally maddening about the world. She ate her congee. Minjai said, "Eventually Park will have young Taewon in a conversation by morning." She said, "Good. The legal team is being briefed on the transmitted files. The process of contacting Cho and the London firm will start at 6. Good. The restructuring of the operational structure," he paused. "That will take time. Months, possibly. The network doesn't simplify cleanly." She said, "I know. And the people within it, who depended on the configuration that no longer exists. You'll figure out what's owed to them and find a way to pay it," she said. "Not because it's comfortable, but because that's what you do when you've built something and then decide to change its shape. You account for the people caught in the change." He looked at her across the plastic table, in the fluorescent light, with a congee between them and the street outside, carrying on its business, and he said, "You're going to want to be involved." It wasn't a question, which told her he already understood the answer. She said, "Some parts of it. The parts that need the skill set I have. And only the parts that I can be involved in, honestly not the parts where my involvement requires me to become something I'm not." She paused. "I'm a logistics consultant, and I read organizations well, and I will not be a passive occupant of my own life. But I'm also not going to become something I didn't sign up to be just because the marriage turns out to be more complex than advertised." He said, "That's fair." She said, "I know it is." The city outside the window carried on. Taxi stopped, and a man got out and went into a building that was lit from inside with the particular quality of a place that stays open, because people need it to stay open at 3 in the morning. Cat appeared on the far sidewalk, considered the street, and disappeared around a corner with the decisive economy of a creature that always knows where it is going. She finished her congee. She set the spoon down. She looked at Min Jae across the table at the man she had married, who had cooked for her on Tuesday nights and listened to her with specific attention and hidden an empire, and burned 12 years of operational archives, and moved toward her, first, in a crowded room, to ask if she was hurt. She said, "You asked me once, before the marriage. You said you needed to know if I'd still choose you if everything else disappeared." She looked at him steadily. "That the money and the ships and the company, if all of it was gone tomorrow, would I have chosen you for what remained?" He said yes. She said, "I told you I would." He said yes. She said, "Tonight tested a different version of that question. Not whether I'd choose you without the empire. Whether I'd choose you inside it, knowing what it is, knowing what it costs, knowing that the map of your life includes territories that don't appear on any public document." She paused. "That's harder than the version you asked." He said, I know." She said, "I haven't answered it yet. I told you tomorrow the conversation." She held his gaze. "But I'm sitting here. That's the starting point." He said, "Yes." She said, "Don't make me regret it." He said, "I'm going to spend considerable time making sure you don't." She said, "Good. That's the correct answer." She stood up and put money on the table and pulled her jacket, the too large jacket that smelled like diesel and formal events, tighter across her shoulders. "Let's go home." They walked out of the restaurant into the city, into the 3-block distance between the harbor and the ordinary streets of Hong Kong, at 3 in the morning, and the city received them, without ceremony and without comment, the way cities receive everyone who moves through them at hours, when the careful public face of the day has come off. She walked beside him, not behind him, not under the shelter of him. Beside him, on the pavement that was the same pavement as always, under the same sky, breathing the same salt-edged harbor air that Hong Kong breathed regardless of what happened on the water. The streets were quiet. Not empty, this city was never truly empty, but quiet with the particular nighttime. Quiet that is not absence but junction. The world running on a lower register, the urgent business of the day suspended until morning demanded it back. She did not think about Marcus Vale. She did not think about Director Yoon, who was somewhere in the city, accounting for a night that had not gone as planned, sitting with the Zurich name like a last chip held close against a chest that had fewer and fewer reasons for confidence. She did not think about Lee Hyun-sok or Seo or Young Tae-won or the transmitted files or the dark stasis light on the wall safe or the 12 years of archive that no longer existed in any form that could be read. She thought about Tuesday nights, about the specific quality of attention that felt like being actually seen rather than observed. About a man who had hidden a kingdom and still managed, somehow, to be someone she recognized when the kingdom was stripped away. She thought about the questions that still needed answering and the conversation that tomorrow required and the long, non-linear process of figuring out what kind of marriage could be built inside the truth of what this one actually was. She thought about the fact that she was walking toward that process rather than away from it, and that this was a choice she was making with her eyes open and her feet on the pavement and her hands at her sides, and that it was the most honest choice she had made in a long time. Min-jae said, quietly. As they turned the last corner toward the apartment building, "The dress." She said, "What about it?" He said, "I'll replace it." She said, "I know you will." She paused. "I don't want the same one." He said, "No." She said something different. He said, "Yes." She said, "I'll tell you what." He said, "All right." The building was ahead of them. Familiar in the way that only home is familiar, the specific shape of a place that has absorbed your presence across enough ordinary days that it knows you without needing to announce it. The lobby lights were on. The elevator worked. The hallway on their floor smelled like the hallway on their floor always smelled, and none of this was remarkable. And its unremarkableness was exactly the thing that made it, at this particular moment, the most necessary thing available. She unlocked the door. She went in. He followed. She took off the borrowed jacket and hung it over the back of a chair and stood in the ruined silk in the familiar quiet of the apartment, and the harbor was visible through the window. If you stood at the right angle, which she didn't tonight. She looked at the room. At the kitchen where dinner had been cooked on Tuesday nights. At the chair he sat in when she described her clients. At the window that looked out over a city that had spent the last several hours being the theater for an evening that had changed the shape of several things that could not be unchanged. She said, "Go to sleep." He said, "Yes." She said, "Tomorrow's going to be long." He said, "Yes." She said, "Min-jae." He looked at her. She said, "I'm glad you came through that door tonight. On the deck. I'm glad it was you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the careful honesty of a man who has spent the evening learning to say things without performance, "So am I." She nodded once. She went to bed. Outside the window that didn't quite show the harbor from the place she lay, the city moved in its nighttime configuration, and the harbor moved in its own configuration, which had nothing to do with the city. And somewhere on the water, the lights of the Chungwang burned steady and orange against the dark. And in an apartment in Sai Ying Pun, with a ruined dress over the back of the bathroom door, and tomorrow's conversation, waiting with the patience of something that understood it would be had in its own time. And not before Zara Ellington closed her eyes. She was 32 years old. She had rebuilt herself once already. She knew how it was done.